Welcome to episode 15 of An Understanding. This episode will be about James Buchanan. If you like it, listen. If you don't, eat biscuits and enjoy. It's early November, 1860. It's actually a couple days after the election of our new president-elect, our 16th president, and the very first Republican president in this country's history, Mr. Abraham Lincoln himself. The current president, though, is James Buchanan. James Buchanan sits in the White House, in the Oval Office, I believe. He's in a meeting. He has called all his cabinet members to the White House itself, and they're all looking pretty sad, pretty dour. The situation is very, very bleak. You see, people need to understand that the South didn't specifically succeed from the Union immediately once Abraham Lincoln was inaugurated. No, they had seceded from the moment that Abraham Lincoln effectively was elected as the President of the United States of America. Tensions were rising between the two, North and South. 7 states were planning to secede from the Union, and specifically South Carolina was the one who were really instigating a lot of the issues. Buchanan is going to be the first president to really deal with the very, very early goings of what would become the Civil War. He calls his cabinet in. There are a whole bunch of different random sects of the country, I guess you could say. All Democrats, Northern and Southern. There's tensions rising within the actual cabinet themselves. Their loyalties are being a little bit testy. You see, the South Carolina governor, Gist, had actually written to the president that the federal government give up forts in Charleston Harbor. Several forts. I forgot what the other one was called, Montelier, whatever you want to call it. And the one that everyone knows very well, Fort Sumter. The fort that will effectively end up becoming the very beginnings of the Civil War, for the most part. He's asking his cabinet members, every single one of them. He talks to Jeremiah Black of Pennsylvania. He's Buchanan's attorney general, and probably the closest to the president at this point. They're both from Pennsylvania, and several other people there. Lewis Cass, one of his Secretary of State. Isaac Toucey of Connecticut, he's the Secretary of Navy, and a whole bunch of different members of his cabinet are all giving them recommendations and really asking him to make a very interesting choice on what to do with Fort Sumter. You see, he doesn't want to leave the fort unattended. It's federal property. And above all else, to the South, that's basically just, the evil warlords and the authoritarian northern regime, etc., that we do not recognize anymore. It's contentious. Whoever fires first is going to be known as the aggressor within the war itself. And Buchanan is basically trying to stop his cabinet from fighting back and forth. He even goes as far as to get help from one of the great generals of the Mexican-American War. One who would be, I think, too old to really participate in what would be the Civil War. General Winfield Scott. He makes very many bold choices during this particular point in time, but ultimately, in a very long-winded way, he does whatever he can to ensure that at the very least Fort Sumter will be defended and will be supplied and will be prepared for an attack. James Buchanan will then leave the White House as he effectively will leave the Civil War in the hands of Abraham Lincoln himself. James Buchanan, as he's talking to his cabinet members, he's right by the fireplace. It's warm, it's lit, it's a cold November. I think at this particular point in time, for the first time in his life, he feels like people don't like him. He feels like he's in the wrong. And for the first time, he's going to really try and do the things that he was supposed to do and do whatever he can to protect the Union from this point on. James Buchanan is our 15th president of the United States of America. I'm really happy we reached 15. I don't know if I was going to keep doing this, so I'm really glad I found the time to actually, focus my thoughts and read as much as I possibly could. But he's our 15th president of the United States of America. And a very, very complicated one. It's funny, history works in the way that it did, that, I guess one would argue in a general population sense, just everyday people have a basic understanding of history, would probably say that we've had two of our worst presidents back to back in a row in this country's history, in Pierce and then Buchanan. I think that's kind of funny. And excuse me, but Buchanan's complicated. He's one who has had probably some of the longest experience in terms of public service and experience within the government itself, that a lot of people probably thought he might have been one of the most prepared individuals in this country's history to attain the office of the presidency. The reality is, though, is just because you work 40 years in a specific office does not make you a good president. Could be actually quite the opposite, to be quite honest with you. And I think it's really interesting with Buchanan. He's probably one of the most consequential presidents in this country's history, where his actions in particular and his level of inaction in a lot of ways ultimately led the door wide open to what would effectively become the Civil War. Now, I will be fair, and I will say this on the onset before I get to James Buchanan, his life, and what his legacy should be, etc., etc. The Civil War was always going to happen. It was always going to happen because people exist. And the presidents in Pierce and Buchanan, they deserve every semblance of blame that they get, don't get me wrong. But it was always going to happen. They just probably expedited it a couple years earlier than it probably would have occurred. So I don't think we should functionally blame them for that. But at the very same end of the spectrum, the truth of the matter is that James Buchanan is a consequential president in this country's history for inflaming a lot of the negative rhetoric, and I guess you could say positive rhetoric for the Democrats and negative rhetoric for the abolitionist Republicans, and really just becoming a clear partisan president who was going to do the things that he was always going to do. I'm doing this because of presidents and people kind of like James Buchanan, because you always hear all these things about James Buchanan, and you hear all these things about certain presidents, and I think it's really interesting, and I think it's really fascinating. And when you do a deep dive on people like this, you try and uncover as much as you humanly can. And the truth is James Buchanan, the more you learn, the more he's a very fascinating and more deeply complicated person than I think one can ever truly get to. And I think it's also fascinating, too, that he's the only president ever from Pennsylvania. You think there'd at least be a couple more, but he's the only one. And above all else, he's the president that's going to be before, unfortunately, probably one of our greatest presidents of all time, in Abraham Lincoln. Although that's up to debate, certainly so. Buchanan is going to be one of the more fascinating episodes I will do. I think out of all the presidents I've done, I think I have the best feeling prior to me doing an episode like this that I generally do have on than any other president before. I'm still probably going to come away feeling very confused about James Buchanan, but ultimately I'm going to give it a shot. I'm going to try and figure out James Buchanan, who truly is an enigma in a lot of ways. I don't think I could describe James Buchanan in, 1,000 words, let alone 20. he's just all over the place. There's a whole bunch of different stories, rumors about him. He's one of the most brilliant men in politics and one of the most corrupt. Yeah, he's also someone that adamantly, functionally believes in the Constitution. Yeah, he also does whatever the fuck he wants to do at times, and it's kind of weird. So, I'll put it to you this way. This is going to be a very fascinating episode, and I hope you guys enjoy it. So let's start with James Buchanan's childhood. James Buchanan Jr. was born on April 23rd, 1791. He will be the last president born in the 18th century. I mean, when he was younger, he made a point of pride that he was just as old as the country was in general. He was specifically born in a log cabin at the foot of North Mountain in the Alleghenies in southern Pennsylvania, in Cove Gap specifically, in Franklin County. His family had moved there for financial opportunities. His father was James Buchanan Sr., and his mother was Elizabeth Spear. James Buchanan's dad, James Buchanan Sr., is a fascinating individual. He's one of the many Irishmen who had left Ireland for opportunity, religious freedom, the whole nines for the most part, in terms of just escaping the British tyranny, and came to Pennsylvania and to live with some family. Buchanans were pretty popular, along with a couple of other Irish families in Ireland in particular, and were pretty well known in America. And he was a hard bargainer. He was a hard worker, a moneymaker, a go-getter. And he met his future wife, James Buchanan Jr.'s mama, Elizabeth Spear, in New York. But the two, got hoo-hoo with each other, and got married, and basically would end up having a total of 11 kids, 8 that would survive into adulthood. James Buchanan Jr. is number 2. The second of the clan, and he will be the oldest surviving child and the oldest surviving son. James Buchanan's relationship with his parents, it's very good, very solid. His parents wanted everything good for them. His father was stern but gentle, and really instilled this functional belief of really just the go-getter attitude in a lot of ways that really pushed James into basically who he was, and who he would become as this go-getter kind of individual. And then his mother, on the other hand, was a very emotionally empathetic person, and really pushed him to be kind. I guess you could say to be ambitious, and which is very different than, I think, the go-getter and the do-it-all kind of attitude. I think she instilled confidence in James Buchanan, is probably how I'm attempting to word it very poorly. For young James, it was touch and go in the early goings for the first year or two of his life. His father was financially pretty settled, I would probably say, but the family was always constantly on the move, and his mother would have 11 babies, effectively. Basically, after him, it would follow like 5 or 6 different sisters, and then like 3 or 4 brothers after that. But for the most part, they're just vibing with each other. His dad does everything, mercantile stuff, trading, farming, the whole nines. And seeing an opportunity, moves the family a little more south of in Pennsylvania to Mercersburg. It's a small village. It has, at this particular point, around 1794, when he and the family moved there, about a little less than 100 families. And by the time he gets there, he opens up a store there, invests in real estate, and within a year he becomes the richest man in town. He's the kind of person that's going to be like, diversify your bonds, people. And James Buchanan Jr. For the sake of this, he sees this, he realizes this, he's like, oh, so that's how you do it. From that point on, his father's successes and his mother's push for education is really going to give James Buchanan Jr. Truly some of the best education that he can receive in that particular era and time. Growing up for James Buchanan Jr. was interesting, to say the least. because I mean they had moved to the town itself because his mother refused to live on the frontier, especially since she's a New Yorker girl, and he was fascinating. He lived in relative privilege, I would probably say, and was really just one that observed a lot of things happening. His parents, etc., his father, his mother, the dealings in town, and I think it's some of the things that he would learn, because he would always tend to be a little bit more, I don't want to say more quiet, that's not the way to really explain it. But, James Buchanan would get ahead a lot in life, just observing things, kind of playing the games a little bit of, camaraderie, and really learned a lot of the public speaking and a lot of the public discussion with his mother, and all the shit ton of sisters that he had. Specifically, they would always talk about public affairs, and really, I think, learned a lot of what would be considered the effeminate characteristics that James Buchanan would be known for the most part. I mean, you have 5-6 sisters, and a large majority of them. I mean, he wouldn't have a brother, I believe, until he was like in his teens at that point, 13, 14 years old. But, for James Buchanan, he's enjoying life, and he's growing up as a very prestigious family within Mercersburg. He went to school at the local school and the whole local classes. There's a whole bunch of different names for a lot of these classes and a lot of these schools in particular. The Old Stone Academy in particular, he really learned from in the Mercersburg. He learned everything: Latin, Greek, math, literature, basic stuff before the family had actually decided to put him into much more rigorous academies, and then eventually college. James was a very good older brother, a very doting older brother, but a lot of before he went to college, a lot of the personality traits that really are reflective in a lot of ways to James Buchanan, are very clear and present here. I would probably say. He was always a people pleaser, and I think part of that is attributed to his family, growing up with 5-6 sisters who heavily relied on him as effectively the only young man of the family until the other sons came around. The father was off doing, capitalist gangsta means, you know what I'm saying? And he was always someone that was very spirited in his youth and into his adulthood as well too. He was always someone that really just wanted people to like him. They really wanted to be a part of the crowd, for the most part. There are people that want to be a people pleaser, but then there are people that want to kind of fit in. And, for James Buchanan, he's always kind of just been doing that throughout the entirety of his life in a lot of ways. It's very clear here when he's growing up, and he's just doing a lot of the deeds with his family. And his family is the closest knit family that you can really get, very religiously strong and personally strong too. In 1807, I believe, James Buchanan, with his family's influence and with his family's capability, is going to attend Dickinson College in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. It's about 70 miles away from Mercersville. It's a really great opportunity. His family's really excited for him. And James Buchanan, he's pretty excited. He's going to take this with full head of steam, and it's going to come out with very fascinating results. I'll put it that way, just fascinating results. Buchanan's time at Dickinson College is very fascinating. He really excelled academically. He was a very highly intelligent individual. In fact, he would actually graduate with honors, even though he didn't think he deserved it. And in particular, I want to add, he went in a little bit later when he was about 16 years old. He went in as a junior, tested for it, I guess you could say, moving up in class. Most people and biographers would know that it's during this time where a lot of hijinks really ensued for Buchanan. In particular, a couple of biographies also make it a point that there's a whole bunch of different, I guess in a lot of ways, anti-establishment kind of rebellions, a variation of like a countercultural movement occurring. Yale, Harvard, Princeton would have various organized rebellions in a lot of ways, and who, for a lot of them, it's basically just them getting drunk and going to taverns and throwing food and just basically just being fucking like rebels, like aggressively so. And Buchanan at Dickinson would, participate in a lot of these specific activities in Dickinson. A very spirited young fellow with a whole bunch of other students. He was very popular. He was kind of like that cool kid. And when he went along with the other cool kids at the college, he kind of just did whatever they wanted to do. But he was like really trying to convince himself to do it, And he would always get drunk and have parties and stuff. And it's funny because it's not because he was a drunkard or a very sad, depressed person. He just wanted to fit in, and he's like, all right, I'll just do it. Just do this, and, I'll be cool with everybody. He actually did get expelled, technically. I think the dean, he conversed with the dean, who allowed him back in on the condition that he actually get his shit together. That was after the second time he was almost expelled. There was 2 separate attempts. But he excelled. He put his full efforts into his education from that point on, and basically graduated with honors within 2 years. For James Buchanan, once he graduated college, it's fascinating to look at him through his mindset and to look how he views the world. I think he views the world a lot like his parents in a lot of ways, which it could seem a little bit heartless, but it's understandable. In how he perceives things. I think he sees things in a much more moneyed, pros, cons, do I gain something from this kind of thing. A very calculated person, and in fairness, one that is actually perfect to be a politician. And he knew that he really wanted to be a politician eventually. Within time, and for him, he knew that in order to actually be a politician, that most people who tended to be politicians were lawyers. So he's looking around. He's basically using some of his father's connections, and he hears about Lancaster. It's this town, which I think was the capital of Pennsylvania originally, and effectively said, okay, that's gonna be the capital. That's where all the lawyers are. That's where all the public businesses are. That's where all the legislators are. I'm going to go there. By the end of 1809, literally the same year after he graduated college, he gets to study as the student of one of the best lawyers in town, Mr. James Hopkins himself. Buchanan was an astute legal student. He and Hopkins had a pretty solid relationship for the most part. He learned everything. Every single legal code that he possibly could, and studied vigorously the Constitution and case law developing around the Constitution as well. He understands around the 1800s, the very early 1800s. So the Constitution, while a lot of the people that had actually created it, like Madison, who would be the president during the time he's studying law, really, there's just a lot of interpretations that go along with it. And for Buchanan, he made a vow. I must make this very important, that he intended to follow the law and the Constitution. Say what you will about Buchanan, but he was always going to follow whatever the Constitution, at least in terms of his interpretation of what the Constitution entailed, was right or wrong. Ultimately, he really wouldn't in a lot of ways, but I'll get to that in a much later part of his life, especially when he becomes president. Buchanan was a very fervent student for the next 2 years or so, 2-3 years while he was studying law. He was gave a lot of effort into his studies. He could actually walk the streets near the courthouses where Hopkins's his teachers' offices were. And he had like papers in his pocket, and he was reciting out loud all the laws and at least his variation interpretations of the laws itself in his own language and his own understanding. And he did that for quite a long time, trying to understand the process and basically how laws were made, and how he developed, because of this process, the ability to kind of give speeches, spontaneous speeches, a whole bunch of different things. The things that he'd be really well known for really are developing around this particular time. After 2 years studying, Buchanan had petitioned to join the Pennsylvania bar. The accreditation system is really fascinating. A lot of oral exams and arguments, and a lot of it was really informal in a lot of those times, in a lot of those ways. It was kind of just who you knew in a lot of instances, and he ended up passing the bar in 1812, and he had a lot of different things going for him. His family was really happy for him. His father, in particular, was very doting on him in terms of his education and his future successes. I mean, at this point, he is the eldest son, so a lot really putting on his shoulders. It's also noted too in a couple of biographies that James Buchanan Jr. really is a lot like his father, cautious, very, I don't want to say manipulative, but he's always looking for the best deal in a lot of ways, and he's always very hesitant in certain aspects, and a little bit dour in mood, and like he's not a very optimistic person, I guess is how I would kind of explain James Buchanan Jr. But for some reason, a lot of them kind of explain that perspective of James Buchanan. Anyways, he decided he was going to set up his law firm and law practice in Lancaster in particular. Harrisburg was going to be the popular of Pennsylvania, which was still being kind of situated, weirdly enough. But for the most part, this was going to be a very real opportunity for him. And he decided he's going to stay in Lancaster and basically create what would effectively be his lifelong home. Despite Lancaster not being the capital or the most prominent city of all time in Pennsylvania, it's still a prominent place with a lot of politicians, judges, lawmakers, and people going in local taverns are arguing about politics. It was a small town, probably closer to maybe 8,000 citizens population, because Mercersburg probably had maybe 100 families top. So, I mean, might as well have been a sprawling utopia. But, it was a very fascinating place to begin what effectively would be a political career for James Buchanan. He, as a lawyer in the first couple months and year or so, was really just trying to do all these high-profile cases. He was very prominent. He was a go-getter. Give him props for that, representing a whole bunch of, and just a whole slew of politicians, left and right in particular. Notably, defending a very prominent judge in Walter Franklin, a Pennsylvania judge who was being impeached for, I guess you could say, a states' rights versus federal government issue. The whole argument, really, I believe, was about states' militia, because at this point, the War of 1812 has already occurred, and it's starting. And basically, if you didn't participate within the war, you could be fined. And Walter Franklin had actually challenged it. He was a Democratic Republican, states' rights advocate, which I would like to point out. James Buchanan started his career as a Federalist. His father was a Federalist. He followed down that career path. Actually had a whole bunch of different unique political ideas. He was a Freemason, wanted internal improvements, a high tariff, a national bank. And a lot of these things he would attempt to initiate, I think, in the early goings of his presidency and his political career. And, he basically continued to do a whole bunch of high-profile cases and really became aggressively and fervently active in the political machine. The War of 1812, like I mentioned earlier, was happening around this particular time, and the Federalists were kind of making their last-ditch effort in the Northeast to combat the war. A lot of them were against it, and one of the people that was really fervently against it was James Buchanan himself, in Pennsylvania in particular. With his rising political stature and everything, who he was just combating in any way, shape, and form James Madison, in this entire political game that's happening. A lot of people, like merchants, factory owners, business people, even a lot of prominent individuals and lawyers, a part of the aristocratic class, I guess you could say, really were a part of the entire Federalist ideal, and he grew up being a Federalist, and naturally for him, he was just going to be combating the War of 1812 and James Madison in general. So for 2 years, he's rising through the entire lawyer game. He's becoming one of the most prominent lawyers, more cases he takes, all these high-profile cases, really defending a lot of politicians, I might want to add, which would help him benefit him a lot later in his political career. He's fervently against the war and really trying to become a politician himself. Soon, though, the war really begins to take over the Northeast. They start invading Maryland, and James Buchanan sees this happening, and he sees Pennsylvania potentially on the brink of war and the brink of attack. So he ends up joining an actual militia unit within Baltimore, Maryland. They called themselves the Lancaster County Dragoons, and they effectively were headed towards Baltimore to help defend it, but that was around the time when there was no second attack on D.C., so they never really had to see any action for the most part. So for the better part of a couple months, endeavoring through all that while his law practice is being taken care of, James Buchanan comes back and he decides, I think it's time to start a political career. Starting in 1814 with a brief break from 1816 to 1821, James Buchanan would effectively start one of the great political careers of all time. That's just generally going to happen. A career that would last for the better part of 46 plus years. James Buchanan using a lot of his newfound fame, even though he really didn't do much during the actual combative battles and whatnot during the War of 1812, but considering the fact that I technically served, really used that as a springboard to join the Pennsylvania House of Representatives. For the next 2 years, within the actual state representation, as a Federalist, he effectively attempted to do a whole bunch of different things. Internal improvements, schooling, everything you can think of that a Federalist did, he basically did. But he was a very, kind of, I don't want to say mischievous, it's not the right word to explain it, but he really knew the political game very well. I think he understood relationships. I think he understood people to an extent. He was always very cautious, and that made him very, very capable as a politician. In due time, a lot of the people that he made friends with during his political career really helped his law practice too. Shit ton of clients from just friends of friends of friends from this politician coming to his aid with this prominent lawyer really helped make him probably one of the most financially lucrative lawyers within the country. So becoming, financially lucrative, becoming a very prominent individual within Pennsylvania, and after serving about 2 terms within the Pennsylvania House of Representatives, James Buchanan wanted to broaden his political appeal. He wanted to jump into national politics, the federal politics, and he thought he could actually get the nomination to be a congressman and a member of the House of Representatives. He attempts his initial political, I guess you could say, campaign to become a member of the United States House of Representatives, but ultimately fails in 1816. He makes a very fascinating choice. Instead of effectively trying to do another opportunities or trying to run for congressional seats, he decides he's going to try and build his life up in a lot of ways and really build on opportunities that he's been given during his time in the state legislature. It doesn't hurt, too, that it's around this particular point in time that James Buchanan would meet a certain fascinating lady. This lady's name was Anne Coleman. I should make a point real quick that James Buchanan is the only president in our country's history that was a bachelor, not a widow, a bachelor, never married, no kids, nothing like that. James Buchanan will be the only president to have that distinction. A lot of it has to do with his relationship with a certain lady named Anne Coleman. Now, there's a lot of stories out there about James Buchanan kind of being a part of the LGBTQ community, becoming the first gay president. There's a lot of anecdotal evidence that really supports that a relationship with a fellow congressional ally that he would bunk with during his time as a member of the House of Representatives. A lot of notes. I hope I can be still the man in your affections. I'm just going to explain it here. It could be. I don't know. I just think they were affectionate and they wrote things differently and colloquially. Their interpretation of that versus our modern interpretation of it might be a little bit different. Not to mention too, it's not like no one was going to make a big deal out of it. And if this was actually something that was there, that was prominent, then I'm not gonna lie to you, it probably would have hit the press at some point in way, shape, and form, especially during his time as a president or in his presidential campaigns. It would have hit the fan, and he probably would have lost. So I don't see it probably, but more than likely, I think people kind of just making negative aspirations against this guy because he's a terrible person and kind of just continually shitting on him in a lot of ways. Unfortunately, whatever your idea of the whole LGBTQ community or gay people in general, whatever, the people live their life. But ultimately, I would argue too, the more you really look into it, Ann Coleman will be the only woman that James Buchanan effectively attempts to court. Truly, there's going to be other women that he will flirt with, have some potential there, but for the most part, Ann Coleman is the only one he deliberately tries to court. They meet around this particular time before he attempts his federal House of Representatives congressional run, and he courts her, and they have a real genuine affection and love and care for her, for each other, for numerous reasons. Both are very attractive people, and both have money. Although a lot of people kind of assume James Buchanan was only after her because her father had money, and then he was always a very flirtatious kind of person. He was always kind of just like, he may have been dour at times and not very optimistic about a lot of things, but ultimately, he was a very friendly person, and I think a lot of people kind of took it the wrong way. And for Anne, she gets word of this particular instance of him flirting with another woman, and she's emotionally distraught, and she ends up breaking it off, and they don't know how, but ultimately she dies within like a month of her breaking off the engagement. A lot of people say it's suicide. I don't know. It's not really fully confirmed, and a lot of things and a lot of the documents are kind of murky. But ultimately, she died, and James Buchanan was barred from attending the funeral, which is pretty fucking rough. I gotta be quite honest with you. Whether he truly loved her or not, I would probably say, at the very least, there was a deep and genuine affection that he felt for her. I don't know how strong it was, so I'll have to come to your own interpretation about that. But, he wrote, I've lost the only earthly object of my affections, and I feel that my happiness will be buried with her in the grave. From this point on, he would never really attempt to date another woman, and he would effectively be throughout his entire life, other than the couple occasions of him flirting with other people, and there might be some potential there, nothing materializes. Ann Coleman will be the only woman that he attempts to court. He was really affected by this in a lot of ways, and I think he took this in a way that was going to reinforce a lot of the things that he did, and this idea of his political career. And you can make an argument that this death really haunted him to a point where that's all he did was put 110% into his political career. And I think it's really fascinating because from this point on, when she dies, James Buchanan really changes in a lot of ways. He spearheads a real strong campaign for a potential House of Representatives nomination, while also maintaining a very strong and exceptionally lucrative law practice, which by 1820, he's literally one of the single most prominent lawyers within Pennsylvania, one of the most financially lucrative ones. And ultimately ended up running yet again for the United States House of Representatives for Pennsylvania, and winning it. and winning it specifically as a Federalist, I might want to add too, even though it's the waning days of the actual Federalist Party too. But around 1820, James Buchanan becomes a member of the United States House of Representatives, really continuing and truly beginning a very long and prestigiously fascinating career within the federal government and public service. James Buchanan begins his career in the United States House of Representatives thoroughly as a Federalist, functionally and fundamentally. Although the party was dying, there's still some hopefuls around this particular point in time, still trying to hold true to the ideas of it in the Northeast specifically. A lot of these would consolidate into the, I guess you could say, Whig version and Whig sect of the Democratic Republican Party eventually. Around this particular point in time, a lot of the other famous politicians, a lot of them who would become presidents, are starting to pop up around this era. The new group, the new generation, that's really going to spearhead Congress and spearhead, the future. In a lot of ways. And James Buchanan was one of these young guns who was going to influence politics in a very real way. He's about 29 years old or so, 28, 29 years old when he enters political office within the federal government itself. And for most of his time initially there, he really votes, I guess you could say, party line within a lot of the Federalist leanings of the Democratic Republican Party, although he would consolidate himself within the actual Democratic Republican Party. He's surprisingly pretty fascinating, I guess you could say. There's a whole bunch of different congressional things that he voted for, a lot of policies he voted for. First and foremost, he was always in support of a relatively high tariff in protectionist terms, but he was also showing signs of his, I don't even want to say Southern leanings, because he's not a Southerner by any stretch of the imagination, but Southern empathy. He disavowed slavery. He never owned slaves, by the way. Yet he's also someone that had personal sovereignty and had that different inclination and idea within the Constitution about slavery in particular. He hoped slavery, just like a lot of these people, which was commonplace at the time, that it was going to dissipate over time and was going to go away through just a general process, it's going to go away eventually. People, it's just going to die out. That was his idea, and that was his process for the most part in his initial goings of slavery. He was a very popular person in Congress, and just like how he enthralled himself to a lot of his colleagues when he was in the state Senate or state legislative and state House of Representatives, it's the same exact thing in the federal House of Representatives and in the House itself. A lot of the same things were happening. People liked James Buchanan. He was a rising star and a really popular person. He enjoyed a lot more power, a lot more influence within Pennsylvania itself, and really became, eventually over the course of a couple years, really one of its top dogs. A lot of it had to do with just his personality and just, for the most part, he seemed like a pretty moderate person. He had a lot of what I would consider northern leanings and northern industrial ideals, and I think I would probably say, financial capitalist pursuits in a lot of ways of gaining power and gaining influence and gaining money. He was a businessman and a go-getter in a lot of ways, and I think he produced himself and pronounced himself in that particular way, shape, and form at times, and yet at the same time he understood the Southern voter. And it's like when you talk to someone who's, I guess you could say, politically moderate, who doesn't really play that bias game and it just attempts to at the very least be objective and honorable, you're going to probably hold them in higher regard than you would, say, someone who's right or especially left-leaning, in my personal view. They tend to be the most crazy, but it is what it is. That's just my perspective. Whatever. Anyways, and a lot of people really like that, and it just so happens that a lot of people in power really didn't like that, and sides obviously are being taken as the years go by from 1820 to one of the most contentious elections within this country's history in 1824, which, as of the recording of this, is probably going to be overtaken by what's happening today. But in this 2020 election, but for the most part, 1824 was it was going to be a firebomb of an election, and James Buchanan, in a lot of ways, is going to be kind of in it in some way, shape, and form and fashion. The election of 1824 was going to be a contentious one, as we all know, and history has shown. Corrupt bargain and all that, and Buchanan, in a lot of ways, kind of gets in the middle of it. You see, from the get-go, Henry Clay being one of the top dogs and the rising stars within, the federal government and the House, being one of the youngest House speakers of all time, I think in his first appointment within the House of Representatives, he really disliked James Buchanan. And in fairness, a lot of people did, and a lot of people, I guess you could say, on that political side of the aisle, really disliked James Buchanan. And really disliked, James Buchanan, who really wanted to get his hands on everything, which is one of the fascinating aspects about James Buchanan. He's kind of someone that kind of peeks his head into every aspect of the political game and really, wants to really be a part of everything. He wants to be a part of every committee. And a lot of it, really, in fairness, is just power. That the unfortunate reality of James Buchanan is that partially for power, because I think he understood and felt that his perspective and his way, just like a lot of these people, tended to be the right and correct way. But for James Buchanan, really ultimately was, in a lot of ways, a power grab. And, same with Henry Clay. It's all about power. And at least in their perspective, it's always about power. I think it's just about showing competence that really gets you elected, and a whole bunch of different things that people see and not power. But for them, as I am ranting a little bit, it functionally and fundamentally is about power. And there's basically this election that's coming up once Monroe decides he's going to retire and renege on any sort of, third term. Everyone's trying to gain power. Everyone's trying to become and position themselves in a particular way for the election of 1824. And Henry Clay, Calhoun, a whole bunch of other people, and everyone kind of feared Jackson, who was this really prominent war hero, this really prominent person. And Buchanan was enthralled by Jackson for two reasons. One, he saw Jackson in a lot of ways as his way and ticket to move up the political ladder, I guess you could say. At this point, he's no longer a Federalist. He will be a Democrat effectively after this election, going on forward and be part of that coalition. But number two, he really just liked Jackson. He saw Jackson as the guy. He wanted him to be president, and also for him and to, exude his political ideas and his Jacksonian power and ideas, and really in a lot of ways as well, gain some political favors. That's just how it was back then. Buchanan really gets himself within the thick of this election functionally after the actual election itself, when Jackson technically wins the election, the electoral and popular vote, but doesn't have the majority of it, which in this case, because it's technically a disputed election, will go to the House. And Buchanan initially starts doing his thing, really maneuvers and really grossly assists Andrew Jackson in getting Pennsylvania's delegation to vote for Jackson. All because Pennsylvania, aside from New York and probably Massachusetts or Virginia, has some the largest delegation. I think they vote 25-1 for Jackson. But Buchanan sees a lot of this happening, and Jackson's being I'm being Andrew Jackson, and I'm just gonna try and be yada yada yada. Buchanan, to an extent, kind of knows Jackson, and he gets an opportunity and goes to see him. And he had visited Jackson at the Hermitage, and really in a roundabout way tells Jackson of what Henry Clay's about to do. And Jackson's kind of just like, yeah, it's not going to happen. They're not going to do that. And in fact, Jackson actually took it the wrong way and kind of thought of that in a lot of ways as a bit of a veiled threat. he thought that he was a part of the actual corrupt bargain that would be a part of in Jackson losing the White House, and Andrew Jackson would effectively lose the election and effectively begin his tirade and the rise effectively of the entire Democratic Party and the Democratic establishment. And from this point on, James Buchanan was 100% within the Democratic Party and the whole Jacksonian ideal. Henry Clay and him, after this contingent election, would basically just do battle with one another for quite some time. Some battles on the House floor where Clay's basically belittling Buchanan for being single, having crossed eyes, and yet at the same time, Buchanan's only going to win. Buchanan's power is only going to rise and rise and rise and rise, and soon after he's going to win several very key appointments. The most important committee that he would effectively win that is of functional note is the House Judiciary Committee. He actually eventually becomes the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, where his powers are really supreme in a lot of ways. And the two most important things that he ends up doing is he works as the chief prosecutor of the impeachment trial of James H. Peck. He's being tried for abuses of judicial powers, and the Senate eventually acquits him soon after. This is much later within his House career in 1831. He also goes against his own committee, though, in a sense, to defeat a bill that really would have actually had drastically limited the Supreme Court's power by taking its authority away to hear its appeals and exercise judicial review, which the House ultimately voted down. And he was a big ardent defender of that, which I gotta give him props, because for whatever your opinion is of James Buchanan, he was a functional, fundamental, 110% believer within of the Constitution itself and checks and balances. He just had a different interpretation of it, though. And at the very least, he got this interpretation right for the most part. He ultimately and effectively spends about 10 years in the House of Representatives. I just want to point this out. From basically the end of Monroe's term, from 1820, or middle of Monroe's term, to the end of Andrew Jackson's first term as president. He spends from 1820 to 1831 as a member of the House of Representatives, combating and rising through the ranks. And, during what effectively becomes John Quincy Adams' presidency and then the beginning of Andrew Jackson's presidency, it's deeply fascinating. His powers are rising, and this is where the rift, in a lot of ways, with him and the Democratic Party kind of begin in some way, shape, and form. He's quite popular, quite powerful, but also kind of dangerous. And Andrew Jackson has, feelings towards him that are fascinating. He enjoys him in terms of him supporting him and having a lot of power, but he also still feels in a lot of ways that the corrupt bargain, that Buchanan was a part of it in some way. And not to mention too, he just understood Buchanan's character very well and felt like he was always going to be a power grabbing kind of person, and really had just no real feelings, I guess you could say, towards Buchanan. I don't know what adjective is going to be good enough to really describe it. Fascinatingly indifferent. That's probably the best adjective I can even use to describe Jackson's feelings towards Buchanan, which is why, it's really interesting and fascinating. It's kind of fascinating how he felt. He didn't like him, but he also understood his political power, his political gain, and the kind of politician he ultimately was going to be in a lot of ways. He could see it in some way, shape, and form. And 1831 occurs, and Buchanan's up for re-election soon, and he decides he's not going to run for re-election. He decides to forego another term. He ultimately ends up deciding to return to private life very briefly. He ends up going back to Lancaster and really just make money again. There's two reasons ultimately why. I think first and foremost, people need a break. Politicians need a break. And I think, for Buchanan, It's going to allow him to recharge, allow him to really come up with ideas, plans, scenarios of how things are going to go. I'm not saying he's a grand mastermind kind of individual person, but ultimately the second reason why I think he ended up foregoing another term was because there's a whole bunch of rumors that Buchanan was going to be hypothetically asked to be Andrew Jackson's vice president, and despite that not having real power, to Andrew Jackson and everything that, he is about, if you're going to be his vice president, a lot of people saw that in that particular time, specifically as like the heir apparent, in the way Andrew Jackson really worked with his vice president, although Calhoun's all over the place, and that's a different story. But ultimately, Andrew Jackson was going to work with his vice president, if that makes any sense. And it seemed like he was going to be the heir apparent. There's a whole bunch of different reasons for that. Although Martin Van Buren ultimately ended up getting the vice presidency, which really did bum out James Buchanan for quite some time. But despite being bummed, Buchanan focused on work, focused on trying to make more money, trying to make Pennsylvania very democratic, and really petitioned and really campaigned in a lot of ways for Andrew Jackson to become president in his re-election bid. And Old Hickory would end up winning in 1828. And James Buchanan, at this particular point, he's kind of like a bit of a Democratic superstar. He's going to be one of the most prominent Democrats around this particular time and around this particular era. He's also about 40 years old around this time. And James Buchanan is really trying to gain some political favors. Intentionally and unintentionally, he's trying to find a way back into Congress, I think, in some ways. But Andrew Jackson has other plans. Andrew Jackson really doesn't want him to be back in Congress. Just plain truth, to be quite honest with you. And Jackson, I think, in some ways even said it himself. He'd rather send him as far away as he possibly could. And it just so happened there's a minister position open in Russia, specifically, to be with the Tsar and whatnot. And they needed a minister of Russia. So once Andrew Jackson gets reelected as president, he asks James Buchanan to be the minister of Russia, personally. And Buchanan's like, really? Russia? Why? Britain. It's not as cold there, but, James Buchanan, a little bit apprehensive, is somewhat optimistic. It's still a very prominent position. And if he does a really good job in Russia, which is still a very powerful overall, autocratic society, things might change. So, 1832, James Buchanan is headed off to become the minister of Russia. Buchanan arrives in Russia in early to mid 1832. He would spend effectively the next 18 months there, plus or minus for the most part. He would spend the next year and a half there. His main goal really was to form as many commercial treaties and maritime treaties as he humanly could with Russia and their chief negotiators for the most part. Trade with Russia was going to be very big and really important there. And for the next 16 to 18 months, he works his ass off. He on the boat ride there learns French and would continue to learn French. Apparently French is one of the chief languages to communicate with during 19th century negotiations, I guess. I think he learns a little bit of Russian and is able to communicate with a whole bunch of different people there. But during that time, he's trying to focus on a whole bunch of different treaties for the most part and trying to negotiate trade. He's trying to make Andrew Jackson very proud. Commercial treaties are very easy. Maritime treaties in particular are very troublesome. The Russians were not welcome to the notion, as one of the biographies would say, free ships make free goods. Ultimately, he got a couple things done and a couple maritime treaties done too, especially after meeting Tsar Nicholas I. He would arrive in St. Petersburg and meet him. And he also, in which he would have a fascinating opinion on Tsar Nicholas I, seeing him as a really interesting person, and vice versa. And he would spend, his time in Russia really enjoying himself, visiting most of Russia for the most part, within his 18 months there, while trying to negotiate treaties and sending letters back and forth to Jackson and a couple other of the Russian delegates that are there that he's negotiating with while he's traveling the country. He gets word, though, in 1833 that there's going to be a Senate seat open. If he wants it, he can take it. 1833. And Jackson's kind of waiting for a moment like this and kind of waiting for an opportunity like this, which I think is really interesting because the Senate seat he's taking is this guy, William Wilkins, that the Pennsylvania legislators are trying to push him out for the most part because he's going to end up replacing Buchanan as a minister or ambassador to Russia. So they're effectively just switching spots. And for James Buchanan, although he's enjoyed his time in Russia, he wants to be a little bit warmer, I'll put it that way. So late 1833, James Buchanan comes back home. And he comes back home returning from St. Petersburg to Pennsylvania in the United States to finally rejoin the United States federal government as a United States Pennsylvanian senator. James Buchanan comes back at a very fascinating time within the political game, the political discussion within the country itself. I would argue, and I probably argued it before, the ideas and the conversations about slavery and abolition really start with this Jacksonian era and Jacksonian period, and he ends up really coming into this movement. And let's be honest, there's actually a lot of people that did not like the abolitionist movement, and specifically James Buchanan. A lot of people really didn't like the abolitionist movement. A lot of people, even including a lot of our presidents in that era in particular, they saw them as this troublemaker kind of, anarcho group in a lot of ways that really was just a threat to the Union. And don't get me wrong, an absolute threat to the institution of slavery. And James Buchanan always felt, at least constitutionally, that the right of Southerners to own slaves was legal and a constitutional, or just constitutionally okay, I guess you could say, is probably one way I could probably explain it, through popular sovereignty. There's a whole bunch of different inclinations and a whole bunch of different ways that people attributed slavery as okay in the South, and he agreed with it and personally saw it as America's duty to protect slavery in the South. He was always, don't get me wrong, he's always sympathetic to Southern, appearances and whatnot, which is why, Jackson and a whole bunch of other people were, kind of iffy about him, or kind of were okay with him for the most part, just because of this really weird perspective and point of view. Like, Franklin Pierce was like just straight up, I hate abolitionists, yada yada, and would really just, a lot of the things that he did really push that perspective in a lot of ways. And Buchanan more so just didn't like them, but he didn't hate them. Does that make any sense? He just thought that they were more of a nuisance and just not really good for the country. That's probably how I would probably put James Buchanan more than anything else. And don't get me wrong, my perspective might change on that the more I read, the more I learn and stuff, but that's just on the onset of just slavery in James Buchanan's growing perspective of slavery as his political career continues. He arrives back in the Senate. He's about 40, his early 40s now. His hair is kind of graying. The pictures of James Buchanan, as we know and see him, are kind of there. He starts having vision problems. If you see some of his pictures, he looks really strange. One eye he's nearsighted, and the other eye he's farsighted, and a lot of this really starts occurring in this particular time, unfortunately. So, this actually worked to his benefit and his detriment at times, where people were always kind of confused with the way he would always kind of squint with one eye and turn his head and really attempt to try to look at you closer, or really open the other eye that's in the back, and just, it's very fascinating and strange, and he really uses to his political advantage. An odd habit, and kind of made people look at James Buchanan as a bit of an oddball kind of individual. He really was a very fascinating politician. Anyways, Buchanan's time in the early goings as a senator, really for the rest of Andrew Jackson's presidency, he voted party lines. He was basically along with like James K. Polk and a lot of these other guys who are within the House themselves, really opposing the national bank, the bank wars that are occurring, and really trying to fight off the institutional, establishment, yada yada, all that stuff. He's along with them. He petitions aggressively against the Second National Bank, censuring and opposing the Senate's censure of Andrew Jackson. And really, the censure of Andrew Jackson by the Senate, which I don't think I even really went to, actually ends up getting eradicated and expunged in a lot of ways because of James Buchanan's political chagrin and shenanigans, I guess you could say, or just his capabilities as a politician. But for the most part, and again, this is just going to be really brief because I want to get to his presidency. For the most part, his Senate time during Andrew Jackson's presidency really is just about him slowly getting the Senate to be involved in foreign policy. Eventually actually becoming a part of the Foreign Relations Committee at the very beginning of Martin Van Buren's presidency. And really ends up becoming a very prominent person within, the House and all that. I mean, at this point, he's one of the top 10 dogs of the Democratic Party by 1836 to 1837, just with all his support, his capabilities, and much to the chagrin, I guess you could say, of Andrew Jackson. I might want to even point out Martin Van Buren had actually offered him the position of Attorney General in his cabinet, but James Buchanan ultimately ended up turning it down because he felt like he had reached the height of his political powers and his political ambition, in his own words. And this was a very fascinating time for James Buchanan. I think part of it is politics, and part of it is just him kind of just doing his own thing. This is probably, in a lot of ways, the most genuinely honest I would probably say James Buchanan has been in his career. I would probably say in a lot of ways during this period of time. And don't get me wrong, I'm not saying entirely, but I think in like some big things, I think it's at least revealed what he truly felt and what he truly endorse, and what he truly, his vision of the country in a lot of ways comes around this particular point in time. Like for instance, he opposed the gag rule, surprisingly, and he was with a lot of senators that believed, and again, it wasn't because he was pro-abolitionist by any means, but he was always, we have the little right to interfere with slavery, then we have little right to, stop people from petitioning it for the most part. He was a pretty fair dude, I think, and at least attempted to really become as objective as possible, especially with his many coalitions and many committees that he's going to be a part of, that he's always chairman of specifically. He was always states' rights, functionally, and he really supported Manifest Destiny, which was really occurring around this time, I guess you could say, as the move westward was really being pushed aggressively. He opposed a bunch of different treaties that really stopped America from really gaining as much territory as they possibly could. The Ashburn Treaty, surrendering a bunch of lands to the United Kingdom, and he also was a big advocate of Texas and the Oregon Territory. And during the Tyler presidency, and during, I guess you could say the William Henry Harrison and Tyler presidency, he's really advocating in a lot of ways this idea of Manifest Destiny. And I guess you could say a lot of ways, too. It really helps influence James K. Polk in that aspect. Unlike a lot of politicians during Tyler's presidency, William Henry Harrison's technical term, and the Whigs had a lot of power and a lot of leeway. A lot of the Democratic figures were kind of in and out of office. Notably, Polk, I think, was attempting his failed governorship. Pierce is kind of just all over the place, doing a whole bunch of different things. And the only one really there is James Buchanan. he's really leading the charge against Henry Clay and really kind of pushing the buttons in a lot of ways, because he's like, Henry Clay, you fucking suck, bro, and your ploy failed and blew up in your fucking face, it's destroying this country, that's kind of how he went about it, which I think tends to be a little bit funny. That's just my perspective. I think it's hilarious. And all the while, he's just gaining more power, gaining more followers, and a lot of following in a lot of ways. So much so that the election of 1844 is coming up, and a lot of people are kind of just like, oh damn, is he going to actually get a presidential nomination? And it's kind of fascinating, to be quite honest with you, when he does attempt to get the presidential nomination within the Democratic Convention of 1844, and which is fascinating too, because he has all the qualities and capabilities of someone who was going to run for president, but unfortunately the biggest issue is that Andrew Jackson still has a lot of leeway, a lot of pull. Andrew Jackson does not like him. And Andrew Jackson really advocates for Martin Van Buren, but then Martin Van Buren decides, nah, I'm not going to do that. And in the initial goings, it's basically Martin Van Buren, a couple of the Democrats, and James Buchanan that are really vying for the spot. And in fairness, James Buchanan did have a shot. He's all about manifest destiny, all about the annexation of Texas, and was a northerner who was going to who had a lot of Democratic Southern support, and that's functionally very important. And in fairness, he seemed like the logical choice, but Andrew Jackson's like, no, I'm still the head honcho of this party, and we're going to choose James K. Polk. And unfortunately for James Buchanan, he lost. He lost the nomination in a bit of a surprise. James K. Polk wins the party's nomination and then wins the presidency. Despite the loss, and despite James K. Polk being president now, all really was not lost, for Buchanan. He did set himself up quite nicely and quite well, if I may say so myself, and he needed people that he can trust, and for all the issues that James Buchanan kind of holds, he's one of the most qualified members within the House itself, and just one of the most qualified politicians to lead, in a lot of ways, his cabinet, or be a qualified member of his cabinet. And it's very clear that James K. Polk, who made the pledge he's only going to serve one term, he's going to make it count. And despite, what a lot of people thought, James Buchanan was going to be someone who was a northerner who was going to help unite the South, and Polk was apprehensive at first to name James Buchanan himself, especially since he just attempted to run for president and failed. That there might be some possibility that he might attempt to usurp the president in some meaningful way, but for Polk, this was a big move for him that was going to help solidify his cabinet in a very solid way. Basically James Buchanan, or Polk, saw Buchanan as basically him, except Buchanan had some surprising pro-British sentiments, which I think is really interesting. I tend to think, I don't even want to say pro-British. That's not probably the right way, or pro-British sympathies. But I think in terms of the courts, in terms of the process, I think Buchanan sees himself as a bit of an old school kind of individual, in line with, more old school founding father George Washington, Victorian era kind of, aristocracy, I guess is one way to put it, rather than this new generation of changing values and changing principles. But regardless, James K. Polk asks James Buchanan to be his Secretary of State, one of the most prominent positions any fucking person would love to have as a cabinet member. And he accepts and becomes the next Secretary of State for James K. Polk. For the next 4 years of his life, James Buchanan effectively is one of the most fascinating and contentious Secretaries of State in just this country's history. He's both one of the best, and I don't even want to say one of the worst, but one of the most conflicting, and one that in a lot of ways would go against his own president. A lot of small battles. Big battles, he was always, I would say, for the most part, behind Polk, especially during war, and ultimately during the other big thing, which is the negotiations for the Oregon Territory. So first and foremost, the negotiations with Texas, he was always for Texas, got Texas. And also the Oregon Territory was for the most part next on the agenda, essentially, for Buchanan and Polk. Buchanan was always one that did not want war. He was aggressively against it, and specifically against Britain. He's like, well, I fought against them technically, and Polk's like, no, you didn't. And he's like, well, I seen them, bro. Okay, you were just a small little boy when that happened, so, you know, I'm just kidding. Bad pantomime of those two. Ultimately, though, you know, he really didn't support Polk's demand on England for the farthest northern boundary, the 54th and 40 parallel, the highest point, which goes way past Washington. He was an advocate of the 49th, and anything more was going to lead the war. I mean, there's some stuff that goes along with it, but ultimately, with that, and like I said, a lot of the big things, he always backed Polk. He always backed Polk in every single meaningful way. And some of the small battles and some issues that would lead to a bit of a contentious relationship with Polk, and really a contentious relationship with the cabinet. It's like, okay, I'll support you on the big stuff, but every other day I'm gonna argue, bitch, and complain about this, that, and that, or how we should do this, or how we should do that. You know, little things like that really probably made James K. Polk's graying hair even grayer, you know. And it's also around this particular time, too, that he's going to be very much a part of the Mexican-American War. Once he finishes the whole, you know, Oregon Treaty, he effectively ends up starting negotiations as the lead negotiator in terms of foreign policy with Mexico. He sends that the big negotiator, John Sidwell, into Mexico territory. He's really a hard negotiator. He's trying to get California and the territory that would be New Mexico and Arizona. He's trying to really get those as territories in a purchase, while also trying to get Mexico to recognize Texas as a United States property and the annexation of Texas. In which case, I gotta be honest, it's pretty fucking bold, and Mexico does not like it. You can argue it's his idea that the war started. I would argue not. I think that's much more James K. Polk. Because in a lot of ways, Buchanan really wasn't for it, although, you know, so there's conflicting reports on it for the most part in terms of his, you know, want to actually join the war, but he is always about manifest destiny. You know, and once, because he's like, initially before the war starts, he's like, I don't want war. But then once, you know, the Mexicans attack when they cross the Rio Grande and attack Zachary Taylor, then he's like, we better get all of Mexico. You know, so it's kind of like, okay, I see what kind of game you're playing at, Mr. Buchanan. And once the war starts and fighting begins, he's like, we gotta get all of Mexico. And his entire cabinet, once the war is over, is kind of just like, whoa, chill, fam. You need to, like, you know, vibe out, smoke a doobie, do what you gotta do, you know? And ultimately, after the whole Guadalupe Hidalgo Treaty was signed, you know, Big Buchanan was a little bit bummed, but he's like, okay, fine, we won, it's all good, you know? For the entirety of the 4 years of his time as the Secretary of State, James Buchanan is really just a fascinating person. You know, he's really, in a lot of ways, consolidating political power. He's trying to be the heir apparent to James K. Polk, since it's very clear that James K. Polk's going to be only serving one term, and he's kind of preparing for this in a lot of ways. Polk actually, on both of his Supreme Court nominations, attempts to nominate James Buchanan and give him an opportunity. But Buchanan kind of goes all over the place. He's like, maybe, I don't know, maybe, I don't know. You know, he's a bit indecisive, Mr. James Buchanan. A lot of this kind of just goes to show his fidgetiness when trying to gain more political power and really just trying to go for the presidency. And Buchanan, ultimately on both attempts, it just says, nah, I'm good on trying to be a Supreme Court justice, even though I've defended them numerous times. And ultimately ends up kind of just becoming a contentious figure for the rest of Polk's term as president. He's really just all over the place, you know? And Polk's kind of indifferent in a lot of ways, and kind of does support him and doesn't support him when the Democratic nomination and the nominating process kind of comes around for the election of 1848. And I know I'm kind of speeding through this, so if you're listening to this, but I really kind of want to get to this presidency, and I don't want this to be a 5-hour long episode, because I could conceivably go like 10 hours for every single president and go with every single detail. But for Polk, or for Buchanan for the most part, it's pretty simple. With his upbringing and with everything in his rise of political fame and power, that this is kind of all leading and culminating into this election of 1848 that he's really putting a lot of baskets into, that he's putting a lot of effort into. He really aggressively attempts to, with the whole war itself, being one of the prime negotiators of the war, being the next in line, etc., and as a Secretary of State, which a lot of Secretaries of State have become presidents, and the Virginia dynasty, etc. But it would not go well for James Buchanan. I don't know if Polk had any influence within the actual party itself, or Martin Van Buren. Democrats, I think, were kind of just realistic and realized a lot of what was going on with James Buchanan, a lot of the things that he was trying to do. He is somebody ultimately that showed that he's just a bit of a power grabber, for better or worse, despite his own intentions for the most part, that this is just what he wanted to be, was to become president, and saw the Secretary of State as a jumping block, or jumping jet, whatever you want to call it, a launching pad to become the president. And when the nominating process came around, he does not win. 1848, the Democratic nominee will be Lewis Cass, who will lose to Zachary Taylor in the upcoming election. Once that happened, James Buchanan kind of came to a personal realization. I don't think I'm ever going to be president. And ultimately, James Buchanan decides he will retire, and he ends up leaving the federal government after the election of 1848. He retires for a second time, and there's a whole bunch of different reasons, ultimately, that he ended up retiring. I would say 3, maybe 4. It depends on how you look at it. First and foremost, he's tired. He's exhausted. His 4 years as Secretary of State's been a very struggling and very difficult and very stressful time for anybody, to be quite frank, let alone Buchanan, Polk, etc. For him, it was not the greatest 4 years of his life. One of even rising to high political peaks, only to fall off at the cliff's edge. Really doesn't help. Number 2, just life. He's no longer a young man. He's in his 50s, and he's probably contemplating a bunch of different things. And really contemplating the future and what he's going to really do. In a lot of ways, for the twilight of a lot of people's lives in this era. Number 3, I think he really wanted to complete the project that he's always wanted to. It's known as Wheatland. He would be known as the Sage of Wheatland. His house that he bought on the outskirts of Lancaster, that would be his ultimate lifelong resting home, I guess you could say. About 20 acres of land. It's a 3-story home with 22 different rooms. He called upon his niece, Harriet Lane, and a housekeeper to really upkeep and keep up the household for the most part during his time, while he puttered around the garden, and just to really keep himself busy in the meantime, while continuing to practice law on occasion, and still taking some high-profile cases, I might want to add, whenever he could, and representing good, famous people. Number 4, above all else, his parents long gone at this point in juncture. His father really died at a quite a young age, I would say, when Buchanan was about 31 years old, and his mother died about 5-6 years after that. And he's really been the head of the household in a lot of ways for the Buchanan family, and really been the patriarch of the Buchanan family, really, at this particular point in time. And periodically, the 22-room house was never really all that empty. He had a lot of family members staying there. They would come visit all the time. He's the head honcho, the lead son of James Buchanan Sr. He had a lot of people. He had a big library, hosted a bunch of guests, and above all else, he came to a conclusion himself that he's not going to give up. He will continue to try to become the president until the day he dies. So Buchanan himself prepares for the election of 1852. Buchanan, despite being retired, kept his name within the national, federal, and political spotlight. He was on the national scene. He made frequent trips to Washington, D.C., and made a whole bunch of different politicians and famous individuals really visiting him at his house of Wheatland. That's where he got the name Sage of Wheatland. And really kept his name within the press in a lot of ways. He was still a national figure, one of the head honchos of the Democratic Party. He was very much against the whole Wilmot Proviso, et cetera, and a whole bunch of other little things, which really kind of pushed him in favor of the ever-increasing divided South, or the Democratic South, and Democrats in general. And also, unfortunately for him, the Northerners who would periodically call him a doughface, basically a Northerner with Southern sympathies, and specifically Southern slavery sympathies, in particular. And this would actually kind of hurt him within the election of 1852. It was basically him, Lewis Cass, and Stephen Douglas, who was a really kind of a rising star within Illinois himself, as the real competition for him in the election of 1852. And I probably said it a little bit before with Franklin Pierce, but the nomination process for the Democratic nomination in 1852, it's pretty fucking lit, bro. Like legitimately. There's a whole bunch of different things that go along with it. I might just do an episode just on this nomination process in general because of all the different players that kind of go along with it. I mean, at one point, it's basically Stephen Douglas and then James Buchanan, and they're fighting each other furiously, both with high political talents, tremendous public speaking skills, and both fought tooth and nail for the nomination. In a lot of ways, both would ultimately end up kind of dooming themselves to each other's causes. They were kind of like the two top dogs, and then Lewis Cass kind of throws his hat in there, and ultimately Lewis Cass couldn't get the necessary nomination, necessary majority vote. And then at one point, his own delegation in Pennsylvania, because of his anti-slavery views, all 33 delegates actually petition against his nomination and nominate the other Pennsylvania person who he just did not like and was against his policy, was David Wilmot, the author of the Wilmot Proviso. Like, it's a lot of shit's kind of just happening. And ultimately, out of all of this and all of this fighting, when one final name gets thrown in there, this young man from New Hampshire on the 48th ballot, Franklin Pierce, ultimately ends up getting the nomination. Buchanan would lose again the opportunity to get to the White House. And I want to make this a very specific point. Because of this, James Buchanan would forever vilify Stephen Douglas from this point on. Their relationship's really interesting. And again, Pierce would win the nomination and presidency, and Buchanan really attempted to support Pierce as much as he humanly could, and really just was, the good person, just clapping along, like, okay, you won, you beat me, etc., yada, yada, yada. And, for a very, very brief time, once the election's been decided, he goes home, does his thing. In a lot of ways, I think he feels as if his political career is kind of over. He's thinking, I've lost for the nomination several fucking times. This is stupid. I'm getting too old, and it's really not looking very good for me. Because he's like, if I try and run again, I'm just going to lose. So I really need to kind of have some sort of political opportunity. And he's kind of waiting in a lot of ways for Pierce to kind of come back and see him and get him a nomination. Because originally Buchanan was there's some stories about him being his original vice presidential nominee. I don't think that was going to happen. It was probably always going to be king himself in particular. But, there's always positing, and there's always kind of just stories and rumors like that. But it wasn't out of the realm of possibility that Buchanan could have been or Buchanan would have been Pierce's vice president, which I think would have been one of the worst executive branches in this country's history. But ultimately, very much soon after, once Pierce is elected and inaugurated within the office, he immediately goes to Buchanan, sends word for him to come to Washington, and he asks Buchanan, "Hey man, do you want to be my minister to Britain?" And Buchanan thinks about this for quite some time. This is a very fascinating opportunity that I don't think he was prepared for. There's obviously, he's always prepared for something, But this is a very fascinating opportunity, like a scenario that, is really, really interesting. He tells Pierce, maybe. Let me think about it. Okay, I'll take it. Wait, hang on. I'm not. Maybe not. I probably not. Okay, I'll take it. That's basically how it went for Franklin Pierce when trying to get just any confirmation from James Buchanan. He accepted, changed his mind, changed it again, rejected the position, and then finally agreed to go after some finagling. For him, this was two-prong, a positive and a negative. For negative, he was going to be outside the country yet again, and he finally settled at home, really was enjoying just his extended family, all the nieces and nephews and everything like that. And, he just didn't want to leave his home that he had spent many years building, effectively for the most part. That, at the same time, though, was going to be a very fascinating situation for James Buchanan in a lot of ways. He and Pierce are they're okay with one another, and I don't think he could have foreseen what was going to happen with Franklin Pierce or the next 4 years within this entire country. I don't think anyone has that foresight to see the political mess that's going to occur and the disintegration of just the political party in general. But ultimately, for James Buchanan, this was kind of a bit of a golden opportunity. Anything negative that happens to Franklin Pierce is just going to be affected on him and the Democratic Party as a whole, but not James Buchanan. He's going to be outside the country, and he is effectively the top dog of the Democratic Party in a lot of ways at this particular point. So for him to go to Britain, be an effective person there, and then come home eventually, who knows? Things might happen, and I think Buchanan saw this as an opportunity. So in the summer of 1853, James Buchanan sails to Great Britain. James Buchanan would arrive in the summer of 1853 in England. His time as a minister and ambassador to Britain is going to be very fascinating, very aggressively politically motivated, and one where Buchanan, during this 4 years, seeing what is happening in America, takes advantage of it in every sense of the word. And it's kind of brilliant in a maniacal way. This is probably genuinely the most maniacal James Buchanan would be, and this is a man who would be one of the worst presidents of all time, and I'll explain why when I get to his presidency. First and foremost, it's fascinating. His main foreign minister that he would always meet would be this guy named Lord Clarendon, who himself was very busy during the whole Crimean War in Europe that Buchanan was going to kind of see in a lot of ways. And, for Buchanan, him just being the ambassador was just making sure everything was kind of good for the most part. So he was really free to extend and try and do a whole bunch of different treaties and whatnot with whatever he could. You can actually have a great relationship, I think, with Queen Victoria. I might want to add around this time. This is a very tumultuous time for Queen Victoria too. God, when did Prince Albert die? I might be getting my times confused. But this would be around that era, around that time, and the dysfunction of her family in particular. Queen Victoria is really, really fucking lit and interesting, and a fascinating person to learn about. But they would actually be good friends. I think Buchanan would return from England with a couple of things that Queen Victoria had gifted him. I forgot what they were. but the American President series on like C-SPAN talks about that. Anyways, his time in Britain is him in a lot of ways seeing what's happening, enjoying British life in a lot of ways, although he is 100% American. It actually became a controversy in British newspapers because he refused to dress in royal British attire to attend all these balls and whatnot, and he would dress as an American, or at least American clothing. And, you know, a lot of people in America really enjoyed that, Northern and Southern. They're kind of like, okay, I can respect that, fam, you know what I'm saying? But the British really didn't appreciate that, so he really didn't do much in terms of treaties and stuff with the British. In fact, a lot of his time there is really dealing with other international treaties, I might want to add. A lot of stuff that's going to affect Pierce and Cuba. So I'll just get to it. Probably the biggest thing while he's in Britain is going to be what is known as the Ostend Manifesto. Basically, when Buchanan is there, he meets with the other American diplomats who are trying to negotiate with Spain, in particular, Cuba and its acquisition. Long story short, the whole Ostend Manifesto is basically Buchanan, in a lot of ways, writing it and influencing it greatly. We will buy Cuba for $100 million, and if you don't sell it to us, we will take it by force. We must have Cuba. It's manifest destiny all the way. Buchanan always wanted Cuba. You know, he's always been a bit of a low-key, just I'm going to be a bit of an imperialist kind of person. He's always just going to try and get land, and that's just how he was. Anyways, it gets leaked, it gets published in America, and people lose their minds in the North, specifically. They're like, we're not this imperialistic power. We're just this backwater constitutional republic that's just trying to survive fucking eventual civil war, bro. Like, what are you doing, you know? But a lot of people really didn't functionally associate it with Buchanan, who were, I guess you could say, uneducated voters, and then who really just blamed it all on the Pierce presidency. Although people in the South really enjoyed it. They really just were like, yeah, that's kind of like okay, I'm cool with that. A lot of people in the South were kind of just like, okay. Although a lot of people in the South just didn't like Northerners. So for Buchanan, it was always seen as a pro-slavery and a pro-Southerner kind of perspective and manifest destiny, etc., etc. It's actually kind of funny. He didn't really have a nickname throughout his entire life. A whole bunch of them didn't stick. The closest would be, I think, is what Southerners would call him, as Old Buck in particular. And Buchanan is seeing a lot of stuff happening, so he ends up basically asking Pierce, "Hey, can I come back, fam? There's an election coming up. Who knows? Who knows what's gonna happen? But I'm tired of Britain, you know." And Pierce is like, "You son of a bitch. All right, just come back. Whatever. I don't even care anymore," because Pierce is just indifferent at this point. So James Buchanan, who requests permission to come home, ends up coming home to America on a British fleet that's going to be in the Caribbean, ironically. And he arrives mainly because he arrives home in 1856 as the Democratic National Convention is underway, ironically. And immediately, as soon as his ship docked in New York Harbor, one day, after I think he turned 65 years old, he heard specifically from Pennsylvania delegates, Democrats specifically, that he had been unanimously chosen as the presidential candidate of 1856. James Buchanan would be a future president. And this is where it starts, in the election of 1856. The election of 1856 is going to be one of the most unique, incredible, and ultimately one of the most truly fortunate elections for James Buchanan. I think this is probably, looking at it historically, probably the only election he would have ever won, presidential-wise. I think if you had to compare it to the other ones. I don't know if he would have won it in 1852, maybe. I think he would not have any of the Northern Democrats support him, though, unfortunately, in that election. But ultimately, this election was an amalgamation, a fascinating election. And I would also just want to point out, too, before I get to everything, the whole results and everything and whatnot, that this would be the last presidential election until 1884 when Grover Cleveland wins, that the Democrat and the Democratic Party would win. This election is an amalgamation of basically, I would probably say, just the rise and fall of just political parties in general. Every single political party is functionally in turmoil in every sense of the word. I am talking about in every sense of the word, okay? First and foremost, the Whigs, the main controlling opposition party to the Democrats, have basically all but folded. They attempted another Whig nominating convention, but basically everyone that was a part of them were just, we're going to go with the whole independent American Party, or just go with the Republican Party. Meanwhile, the Republican Party is the thing at this point, but it's still weak, and it's still kind of all over the place, because it really is this rising abolitionist movement to a point where people are kind of just like, cool, like, we're this really well-formed political coalition, but it's still not strong enough in a couple of key states. And ironically, the biggest opposition to probably the Republican Party, especially in the North, is known as the American Know Nothing Party. That would be nominating Millard Fillmore and Andrew J. Donaldson for vice president. I should probably say the big players real quick. The Democratic Party nomination is James Buchanan, with John C. Breckinridge as his vice president. The Republican Party is John C. Fremont, with William L. Dayton. Fremont's a veteran of the Mexican-American War. He's a really big explorer and an ardent abolitionist who's really genuinely against the expansion of slavery, or what they call popular sovereignty, which is kind of just like basically whatever the states go, they go. I think it's really interesting. If he would have been elected instead of maybe Abraham Lincoln in the next election, I think that would be really interesting, because he was, for the most part, adamantly an abolitionist, which I think is really interesting. And he really fundamentally opposed the expansion of slavery in every meaningful way. So he would have been a very interesting individual. This election, like I said, is the amalgamation of everything. Like, this is a point when the Whigs failed and the Democrats are in fucking turmoil in every meaningful way. Every single Democrat that was in the states really faltered. Pierce was just a failure as a presidential candidate, and they were trying to find anyone but Franklin Pierce. Lewis Cass was effectively getting too old, and he was just a failure as a presidential candidate, who nominated quite a couple times, and I just think it's really interesting. And then, of course, Stephen A. Douglas. He's probably the only other big one, but considering the fact that his name is plastered all over the Kansas and Nebraska Act, that would lead eventually substantially to a lot of turmoil, deaths, and a lot of division within this country. He's not a very prominent individual. This is a point within this country where anything can go. Anything can happen. There's like 16 different political parties that are rising up around this particular point in time. There's the American Party, North American Party nomination. There's a whole bunch of different coalitions that are kind of going with one another. There's a Liberty Party, a Free Soil Party. Everything is happening, and no one really knows what the fuck is going on. And James Buchanan gets this nomination really just because he's not in the country and he doesn't have the negative backlash. They kind of are forced to give it to him. I think that's really interesting. So anyways, the election kind of goes around, and it is contentious. The main issue is slavery. It will be the issue for the next fucking 10, 15 years for the most part. It's always been this ever since, I would probably argue, in a lot of ways, since James K. Polk or Van Buren has really been president. It's been a really contentious problem, and it's not going away. And a lot of people, especially in the South with such a large and strong coalition, ultimately ends up really leading the electoral and popular vote. I will say this is a very fascinating election. If the Know Nothing Party really existed, Republicans, if I'm going to be honest, probably win this election. And I think the country would be very different, and history would be very different if that had actually occurred. You see, here are the final vote totals, by the way. James Buchanan will become the next president of the United States. He wins 174 electoral votes, the majority, against John C. Fremont's 114 and Millard Fillmore's 8. The biggest problem, functionally, is that James Buchanan only gets about 45% of the popular vote, and Fremont and Fillmore really split the popular vote. Fillmore ends up getting almost 900,000 votes to Fremont's 1.3 million. And, popular vote doesn't mean anything, and, it's not like all those votes are going to go to, Fremont by any stretch of the imagination. The biggest problem, though, is that specifically Fremont lost this election because Fillmore had basically won a couple of specific states, or at the very least against Fremont, in order. Sorry, I'm wording this horribly. Fillmore had won the plurality of the vote against Fremont in a couple of contingent states, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Louisiana. And specifically, had Fillmore not had any of those votes, and let's just say, hypothetically speaking, a slight majority of those votes go to Fremont, one or two of those states might flip. Not to mention, too, Fremont won Illinois, then things might have actually changed. Things might have actually been a little bit different in terms of maybe Fremont winning the election. Or had Fillmore actually campaigned hypothetically, because they really didn't, and had really pushed for harder for any of those states, Kentucky, Tennessee, maybe even Illinois, it would have pushed the election into the House of Representatives and would have been another 1824 kind of election. This entire election is really fascinating and interesting, and I really can't wait to go into a deep dive on it. But ultimately, James Buchanan will be the 15th president of the United States, avoiding a House contingent election with a coalition, I would probably say, made up of anti-Democrats. James Buchanan will lead this country into civil war. Dun dun dun. For Buchanan, he comes in at a very, very crucial point within this country's history. Probably one of the single most crucial points in this country's history. A lot of people really don't blame Abraham Lincoln for the Civil War in a lot of ways. Even some of the Southerners, I think, in a lot of ways, really don't blame him. They just see him as the byproduct of what effectively ends up becoming what people would say is Buchanan's war, ultimately, is the Civil War. The actual division within this country, for the most part, is pretty complete, and really is only going to be expedited, as the years go on, especially near the end of Buchanan's presidency. North, South, Northern industry versus Southern agricultural, the agricultural economy. Pro-slavery, abolitionists, whole bunch of different things, and people ultimately just trying to gain power. Buchanan's presidency really ultimately is one where, the direction of the country is really going to be really decided, ultimately. And I just want to point out and ask this question if Buchanan could have avoided the war, and ultimately, unfortunately, regardless of what he did during his presidency, the war was always going to occur. That's just my perspective. But I think he probably expedited it straight up just a full decade with a lot of his actions, a lot of his inaction, a lot of the things that he ultimately ended up doing. And this country needed a very strong leader, and Buchanan, I think, was ill-prepared for what was going to happen during this point within the country's history. So before we get into everything and I explain what America is like, specifically his cabinet, his presidency, this presidency, this moment, it's probably one of the more important presidencies this country has ever needed to function, to be bipartisan, etc., etc. And ultimately, although he attempts to, it ultimately does not reach that conclusion, in my perspective. So without further ado, what is America like during and preceding James Buchanan's presidency? What's going to happen or what are the events that will lead to a whole bunch of different things that will happen during his time as president. First and foremost, a lot of the obvious things. Foreign policy, it's going to be about more expansion and trade in Asia. Not to mention, too, just, dealing with Europe. A lot of things are going to be happening in Europe. The general tail end of the Crimean War. I think Napoleon III is still there. He's going to be doing some stuff. Queen Victoria's still there, rocking her Victorian-ness, and, just things that are, it's just going to be status quo in a lot of ways, but it's also not going to be status quo. It's going to be really complicated. I'll explain that when I get to and talk about his foreign policy. Domestically, though, is where Buchanan, ultimately, as I had alluded to earlier, is going to be a very fascinating individual. The divisions within this country are really, really breaking us apart. North, South, slavery, abolitionist. Most people, I would probably say, are kind of in the middle, if I'm going to be 100% honest with you. I'll tell this too, Abraham Lincoln, when he came in, wasn't going to try and stop slavery. It was only when the South seceded, it was basically, well, I'm going to have to put my foot down then on this because you're not seceding from the Union. And if you're going to play these games, then we'll have to, free the slaves. And at that point, and for Buchanan, it was in a lot of ways just like Southern secession, or he was more like Pierce, if anything, but a little bit more different. And I'll explain that when I get to it. But I guess the point I'm ultimately trying to make, though, is that the country itself, socially, is divisive as it's ever been, and it's not getting any better. Many things are already happening. The Kansas and Nebraska Act, the tail end of it, and the really just pure bloodiest conflicts, and the excessive, aggressive, and violent, what would technically speaking and definition-wise speaking be considered domestic terrorism by John Brown. So, technically speaking, it's domestic terrorism, is going to occur when he's going to be leading a whole bunch of different slave revolts, and he's going to basically just overtake a lot of the stuff that's going to happen during James Buchanan's presidency. I should also point out, too, that, economically speaking, which I probably should have alluded to a little bit before with Franklin Pierce, but I don't think it was a functional reason why he wasn't reelected or chosen as a nominee for the Democratic Party. That was more of the whole social stuff. Ultimately, it was basically a slight recession, I would say, near the tail end of his presidency, and there's a whole bunch of different reasons for it. But ultimately, the Panic of 1857 is going to occur during James Buchanan's presidency, and the recession is going to get better. It's going to be a slight depression, I guess you could say. I don't want to say a slight depression. It's going to be a depression with some recession going along with it, which there's two factors, I would say, that would lead to the Panic of 1857 and the economic stresses that are going to be occurring for really, I would probably say, the next decade and a half. Ultimately is war, international economies just going all over the place because of conflicts left and right. And, Franklin Pierce's presidency is always about, trying to build the transcontinental railroad, over-expansion. People are leaving and going to a whole bunch of different places all over across the country and trying to settle it. And, we're moving too fast, I guess you could say, as an economy. The telegraph is really being widespread in everything. And ultimately, I think actually just attributed to the actual financial crisis expediency, And point being, the reason why the telegraph is so important is because, it's not like you have to do a horseback ride for 2 days to go to another state, You can just beep, 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 beep. Oh, yeah, this happened. And information is being transmitted at an expedient pace to a point where, things are just being heard much quicker, much faster. Stocks can go up and down just based on information. And things are definitely changing. As I guess in a lot of ways, the second wave of the Industrial Revolution and market revolution, transportation revolution are really going to occur for parts of the next decade or so. And it really kind of begins here. I might have said earlier, but I would probably say where the steam engines, et cetera, the big trains that we think of when we think of cowboy movies and stuff are really going to be occurring during this era, Cowboys are coming, fam. So hold your horses. So, as America is being America, divided beyond all belief of reconciliation at this particular point in time, let's talk about his cabinet. It's a very strange cabinet. Buchanan does his absolute best to try and bring in Northerners and Southerners. The biggest issue is that he brings in a shit ton of people that ultimately, for the most part, really are going to be harmonious in the sense that they all have the same perspectives and viewpoints, specifically with slavery. Most of the people, I'd probably say, ultimately would end up agreeing with James Buchanan on a whole bunch of different things. His cabinet's pretty fascinating. First and foremost, let's talk about his vice president, John C. Breckinridge. Excuse me. If he actually ends up becoming the youngest vice president ever in this country's history, which I think he's only 37 years old when he gets elected as the vice president. And he and Buchanan do not have a good relationship whatsoever. He ultimately ends up basically just annexing Breckinridge from his cabinet, although Breckinridge stays there for all 4 years for, some political, et cetera, et cetera. He will eventually be a presidential nominee in the election of 1860 against Abraham Lincoln, along with a couple other people as well. Presidential loser Lewis Cass ultimately ends up becoming his Secretary of State, although in fairness he ends up being relatively marginalized. Basically foreign policy is really all for sorry, my brain's not working. It's all for James Buchanan. That's all he's good for. And ultimately ends up having the Assistant Secretary of State, John Appleton, doing a lot of the stuff as his right-hand man, and Lewis Cass is basically like, well, fuck you, I'm outie after some point, which he then gets replaced by Jeremiah S. Black, who basically serves on several different points of his cabinet, because Black was actually original Attorney General, and then the Attorney General spot, ironically, gets replaced with a man named Edwin Stanton. And if you're wondering why that name sounds incredibly familiar, correct me if I'm wrong, he actually ends up becoming Lincoln's Secretary of War and Johnson's Secretary of War, and is one of the biggest reasons why is the pinnacle reason of trying to dismiss Edwin Stanton that would lead to not Lyndon Johnson. I can't think right now. My brain's not working. Andrew Johnson, to basically, God, why can't I think of my name? Andrew Johnson, to actually end up leading to his impeachment trial. Sorry for that minute of me just having a brain fart. Anyways, for the most part, he does have a bit of a mixture of Northerners and Southerners. A lot of these Southerners, specifically, would be participating within the Civil War itself. A couple of them during in the actual Southern government and the Southern Confederacy government itself. Buchanan attempting to nominate Supreme Court justices was complicated. He would ultimately have two attempts at it. One, when Peter Vivian Daniel had died, which that was a very contested one, in which case he fell one vote shy of his nominee, who was actually his Attorney General, Jeremiah S. Black, and then eventual Secretary of State, or replacing him as Secretary of State, Lewis Cass as Secretary of State, ends up losing by one vote in short of the nomination, in which case that post would eventually be filled, I believe, either by Lincoln or Andrew Johnson. It's a little bit finicky right now with my head. Ultimately, he would get one nomination, and that was Nathan Clifford of Maine. Clifford's a fascinating person. He's one of the very few Democrats, I would probably say, that remain loyal to the Union. He's a Northerner, and really viewed a lot of things in James Buchanan's presidency. But for the most part, I would probably say was pretty fair in legislating or judiciating. And he's also one of the few members that's actually served in all three branches of the government at certain points in his life, I might want to add, because he had served with James K. Polk's cabinet, as I noted probably earlier when I was talking about James K. Polk, and he would actually be a Supreme Court justice for quite a long time. And he ends up barely getting, confirmed, I think by a vote of 27 to 22 or 26 to 23. So what is going to happen specifically? What are some of the events that will happen during James Buchanan's presidency? Well, to start off with, a lot of the companies, like I had said before previously, from other presidents are going to, really start popping up. For instance, JCPenney, I believe, or not JCPenney, Macy's. Sorry, I'm getting things confused. Are going to start popping up around this particular time during James Buchanan's presidency. The first commercially produced toilet paper, thank God for a lot of those people there, are going to start being produced in America as well. Giuseppe Garibaldi, who's a part of he starts this whole international Italian association, and really I think he's someone that's going to be the unifier of Italy, because you have to understand there's a whole bunch of different states within those particular areas, and same thing with German unification. That's really going to be expedited when Otto von Bismarck, for instance, does his thing. So Giuseppe's one of those people is going to be unifying the states into one unified country. A lot of books are going to be made and written during this time. Madame Bovary, from the French author Gustave Flaubert, is going to occur at the very beginning of James Buchanan's presidency. The first elevators installed in New York City on Broadway. The first soccer, or if you're European or any other place that's not America, football team was founded in England. And also Queen Victoria announces that Ottawa is the capital of Canada. Go figure. Queen Victoria, which I think it's still a province of Britain, if I'm going to be honest. But I don't know anything about Canada, if I'm going to be honest with you. The British Princess Royal Victoria weds Prussian Crown Prince Frederick Wilhelm, who would be, I believe, the father of Kaiser Wilhelm II, ultimately, who would be the Kaiser during... Kaiser Wilhelm II is a really fascinating person. I can't wait to do an episode on him. And, Darwin and Wallace's theory on evolution ends up becoming really widespread, and he's going to write his books eventually over time. The Origin of Species, that's going to be really controversial, and talk about natural selection, evolution, little things like that. Paris brings up the can-can dance, and I think that's really cool. Charles Dickens publishes A Tale of Two Cities during his presidency. History is fascinating, people. And Big Ben, the great clock of Westminster, begins announcing the time in London. It's actually put in. Alfred Tennyson, who wrote the series King Arthur Legends with the Idealists of the King, the first flying trapeze circus performs in Paris. Paris is pretty fucking lit, fam. I'm not gonna lie. They're feeling themselves right now. I'd also like to point out too that this is a very interesting fact that's going to start occurring later on within this country's history. Is this man named Edwin Drake strikes oil in Pennsylvania. America's first oil well begins pumping in Pennsylvania during James Buchanan's presidency. The British Open is going to start during James Buchanan's presidency. And above all else, I think one of the great novels of our time, along with The Tale of Two Cities, is the first installment appears of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, is going to occur during the tail end of James Buchanan's presidency. Buchanan is inaugurated in March 4th, 1857, and he makes two very fascinating claims. First, he talks about, popular sovereignty. People are capable of making their own destiny and shaping their destiny for themselves, based off of what the Constitution allows, for the most part. And he makes another claim and an oath as well that he will only serve one term. First and foremost, main reason ultimately is that he's about 65 years old by this particular point in time. He's no spring chicken by any stretch, or 66 years old. He's no spring chicken by any stretch of the imagination, and ultimately just wanted to put up his own perspective and his way, shape, and form to try and make this country better in his view. And before we get to the entire domestic policy aspects of it, I think we should just talk about his foreign affairs and foreign policy real quick, because that'll be pretty short. When Buchanan was brought in, I think he had the interpretation and assessment that he was going to be much more foreign policy based than anything else. That certain domestic court cases, one that would be Dred Scott, would ultimately decide, finally what slavery was going to be about, and ultimately was going to focus more on actual international trade, et cetera, and diplomacy in that aspect. And there's really two things I would probably say would really be the biggest aspects of his foreign policy. First and foremost, it kind of goes together too, would just be Cuba and Central America in general. He wanted to annex Cuba. That's always one of his things. He just wanted Cuba and wanted more land, and he really focused on the Caribbeans and really just continued what Franklin Pierce ultimately was trying to do in a whole bunch of different things. But ultimately, the second aspect of it was defending Cuba, Monroe Doctrine, and a whole bunch of British interventions, and just British basically were trying to intervene for the most part with their government, which is fascinating because Queen Victoria is losing a lot of aristocratic power, and the government itself over there is being very liberalized and being very broad and taking a lot more power. But ultimately, Britain, because Britain likes to invade shit and be one of the great world powers, ultimately starts pressuring a whole bunch of Central American countries and using their navy in order to establish their strength, et cetera. And I'm not saying war would have broke out by any stretch of the imagination, but things were getting testy for periods of time between 57 to 58 specifically. And ultimately, America would effectively win out when America sends their navy, and they're basically like, "Hey, boy, get out of here, boy." You know what I'm saying, fam? Not to mention, too, the other conflicts with Mexico that were still happening around this particular point. Settlers were still being harassed, some people being killed. There might have been war with Mexico. And ultimately, a lot of things did not lead to war with Mexico. Mexico would effectively end up paying the reparations, ultimately, for a lot of the stuff that's been happening. And, a whole bunch of stuff domestically, like John Brown, is really tying Buchanan and a whole bunch of divisions within the country are really stopping anything excessive from happening in terms of his foreign policy. And ultimately, that's basically it. Once the Dred Scott case really occurs, 95% of James Buchanan's presidency is going to be devoted to America. Where Buchanan shines is going to be with his domestic affairs, his domestic policy, and what effectively will define his presidency is his domestic affairs. Let's be honest. Buchanan is, widely rated as one of the worst presidents of all time. Him and Pierce are always going to be on the bottoms of every single list, but I started this series to try and figure out, if a lot of this was true, whether, some people that history has kind of looked at are actually pretty shitty, or if, vice versa, if all these good presidents that we hear about are actually pretty horrible individuals and people. Can't wait to get to an episode of Woodrow Wilson or FDR. I think that's going to be a very fascinating episode that I can't wait to get to. But for the most part, I wanted to see if I could find anything contrary to the point of, the reality of James Buchanan in a lot of ways. I wanted to test myself and push myself and to look at the counter perspective and point of view of other people and trying to understand, was Buchanan really that bad, or has history just looked really down upon him and people have manipulated history, manipulated stories, fake news, et cetera, however you want to interpret it. And for the most part, I think most people generally get Buchanan right. The only positive qualities that a lot of people always point to when it comes to James Buchanan ultimately ends up stemming from, I would say, just, his capabilities, his character, and that despite being arguably one of the most, if I'm going to be 100% honest, and I'll get to it in just a second, one of the most corrupt politicians and presidents in this country's history. One that, believed in the Constitution, albeit his own unique interpretation and perspective, which leads to effectively what's going to be the very, very, very first thing that's going to really cloud his presidency and really, and part of my language, and I probably cussed a lot before, but really just fucking ruined any chance of him having a positive presidency would be the Dred Scott decision. Now, for those of you who just didn't pay attention in history class, the Dred Scott decision is probably the one decision that, from once this particular choice was made, there was no going back, regardless of what was going to occur prior. This decision was going to come down. The only way that this wasn't going to come down and start civil war, ultimately, is if this had never happened. But this happened, and a choice was made. Regardless of what direction the decision actually went with, it was ultimately always going to lead to civil war. And that's why the Dred Scott case, which I'm going to explain in a second, is one of the single most important decisions this country's ever had. And above all else, it really shows why the Supreme Court ultimately, that third branch is one of the single most important branches in this country's history. So the precipice of the Dred Scott decision, which, by the way, Buchanan had actually hinted at before during his inaugural address, and this decision was going to occur 2 days after his inaugural address, by the way. The backdrop, understand that this country's in turmoil. Kansas and Nebraska are still fighting in a lot of ways. There's still a lot of disputes there between northern and southern. There's two different types of government that's basically there. The abolitionist government, the slavery government, whatever you want to call it. The divide in Kansas and Nebraska alone is paramount. And Buchanan had hoped, in a lot of ways, that the Supreme Court decision was going to be the one that's going to just settle this once and for all. That's just what's going to happen. We're going to figure it out, and this is what's just going to happen. Now, if you're wondering what the actual Dred Scott case is, Dred Scott was a slave from Missouri, I believe, or one of the specific very hard southern states, and had actually went with his owner in Illinois, or in the Wisconsin territory. His owner was an army surgeon. And Scott basically lived there with his owner for quite some time before going back to Missouri. And Scott claimed, petitioning a whole bunch of different people there, that since his residence, technically speaking, was in Illinois and the Wisconsin territory, that in a free state, by the way, that it made him a free man. So, the entire Dred Scott case would go on for quite a long time after this. And ultimately, the southern, I don't even want to say southern, but very hard Democrat and hard states' rights, and I don't want to say pro-slavery court, but let's just be honest, it was a very pro-slavery court, decided and ruled in the actual court case itself that the Constitution did not recognize slaves as citizens of the United States, meaning that they had no rights which any white man was bound to respect, including the freedom to sue in a federal court for their freedom. That a slave effectively was nothing more than property. No more rights than a horse or a chair, I believe, was one of the actual things that might have been part of the court documentation. Although that's more specifically hearsay, if I'm going to be honest with that. But point being, there was no rights there. The ownership of the property, since they are property, was held and protected and guaranteed by the Constitution. That since he technically had been living and was a slave in Missouri, that it does not change his status whatsoever. You have to understand, too, it wasn't just that sparked the entire chaos that was going to ensue. Two things ultimately would occur, because by definition of what this meant constitutionally, that the Missouri Compromise, and in effect, a lot of ways, the compromise, other compromises, but specifically the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional then at that point in Jecture, in that slavery could not be banned in new territories nor new states. And for, Buchanan, he's kind of just like, this will settle it once and for all. Buchanan was going to be wrong 100%, unfortunately for them. The truth and reality is that, first and foremost, a lot of the abolitionist movement started with religion, actually. I'd probably say it was like religious crusades that said all men are created equal kind of thing, et cetera, et cetera. It really started in that structure where the abolitionist movement grew and grew and grew, moral rights, et cetera, et cetera. And basically the abolitionist movement just was going to fight back in every sense of the word. You can blame John Brown and all that from this specific court case, I would probably say, is the biggest thing. And Buchanan, he wanted to end the tensions of slavery and wanted to end what would effectively be becoming the very rising Republican Party, but ultimately would end up failing in that regard, as I will explain in just a quick second. You see, I think in a lot of ways Buchanan didn't understand the actual state of the country, because in fairness, he was away for quite some time, and I don't think he understood really how bad the division was within the United States. And I'll try and go through a more succinct timeline for the most part, but I'm just going to talk about, bleeding Kansas and the sectional crisis that occurs first, because this is effectively going to be, for quite some time, at the very least, this is going to dominate for the most part the first 2 years of his presidency, and I would even argue the entirety of his presidency. So I'm going to just talk about most of what bleeding Kansas and the rising tensions that are going to occur during this point in time. I'll try and be quick, succinct, and I will try to make it as specific as possible and digestible. So bleeding Kansas, like I said, had started during Franklin Pierce's presidency, where conflicts were occurring with the Kansas-Nebraska Act that was appointed by Senator Stephen Douglas, who's one of the most fascinating political figures within this country's history. And the tensions rose between pro-slavery border ruffians, a lot of them coming from Missouri, crossing into Kansas to vote, and then the free soilers who were opposed to slavery and wanted Kansas to come in as a free state. Because you have to understand, if you want a state to become annexed, et cetera, and ratified as a state, you have to come up with your constitution and have a certain amount of people. And the big issue for them, though, was in terms of trying to create a constitution was the constitution itself was basically going to be pro-slavery or anti-slavery, et cetera, and that was the big issue between, I guess you could say, the majority of the proposed constitutions that were coming up around this point. So when Buchanan comes in as president, the Democrats in the pro-slavery wing had endorsed this pro-slavery constitution called the Lecompton Constitution, which was very pro-slavery. And I thought it was really interesting because the document itself that document in particular had only been supported by a small portion of the whites within Kansas themselves. Even some of the pro-slavery people were like, whoa. Even the territorial governor, I believe, said, don't do this. You're going to make things, a lot worse. And instead, Buchanan went to Congress themselves to try and ratify this specific constitution. In Congress, Stephen Douglas, who's there, basically just said, no, I don't care what I want slavery, but this is not how we're supposed to go about doing it. It was fraud. And don't get me wrong, a lot of this it's politics, how it is. That being said, he's right in his perspective, because he claimed it was fraud because it's not popular sovereignty. That was the principle of how people were supposed to vote within Kansas itself. And if only a small minority of the voters had actually voted for this, then this is not a legal document that should not be ratified as the Constitution. Even some pro-Douglas and just some of the Democrats actually sided with the Republicans who are in Kansas and in Congress at this point to basically say, no, we're not going to do this. Anyways, basically Buchanan and Douglas were arguing with each other for quite a long time. This was a very long debate within the House itself, and ultimately they decided a compromise solution, re-vote for another constitution itself and a new election to be held within Kansas. And eventually, over time, after 3-4 years of conflict, which I will explain in just a second, literally led to a whole bunch of different things. Kansas ultimately ends up coming in as a free state after a couple months of Abraham Lincoln's presidency in 1861. But this really damaged Buchanan in every sense of the word, combined with a whole bunch of different things. The economy, Utah, a whole bunch of mismanagement of everything. Buchanan, you want to talk about an approval rating, it's only going down from there. I would also like to point out really quickly, too, that this issue with Bleeding Kansas and the whole Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Leah-Compton issue is very, I guess you could say, landmark in a lot of ways for more than things that we can actually think of. First and foremost, this battle between, I guess in a lot of ways, Buchanan and Stephen Douglas, and basically just people in the House and Senate arguing for pro-slavery and anti-slavery, did a lot of things, and it needs to be understood. The first thing it does is it really splits the Democratic Party up. Ultimately, this was like the final crucial bang in the nail between the Southern Democrats and the Northern Democrats. The Northern Democrats were dough faces, and a lot of those people, despite being Democrats and not even pro-slavery, but states' rights, are basically just like, nah, I'm done. This is a mockery of our constitutional system, and a lot of these people would defect into becoming, Republicans eventually. And this also helped Abraham Lincoln rise to prominence too. He wasn't in Congress, I believe, at this point. But for Abraham Lincoln, this was a very opportune time for him. He was running for office, in specific against Stephen Douglas. They actually had to stop Congress and this entire debate for the most part, so Stephen Douglas could run for public office again and win his seat. And Abraham Lincoln and Stephen Douglas would have their famous debates, in which Abraham Lincoln would effectively end up winning a whole bunch of popularity contests and would effectively help him become the president about 3 years later in 1858, once these debates actually happened. Ultimately, number 3, this would actually only inflame tensions, guerrilla warfare on both sides, really just being expedited. And if I can just say this too, domestic terrorism really beginning to occur around this particular time that would make this entire issue with Kansas a pinnacle point that would lead to civil war with a man named John Brown. You see, fighting never stopped and would actually continue up until probably, I would say, the Civil War between, relatively speaking, small sects of people, like small little skirmishes left and right. People were fighting, burning buildings, hanging people, shooting people. It was pretty lawless there. And it reached a point where Buchanan would actually have to send in the military, send in federal troops to basically quell a shit ton of attempted insurrections, notably by, a whole bunch of abolitionist individuals and groups there. That were wreaking havoc, excessively so, which scared a lot of the Southern Democrats and a lot of the Southerners who were basically like, oh, these people are going to try and take away everything that we have, etc., etc., Malati. There was one person in Harper's Ferry, Virginia, which because John Brown went to Kansas, and then he went to Virginia in particular, where abolitionist John Brown, his followers, had attempted to take weapons to instigate widespread slave uprising. The local militia had actually surrounded them, and fighting ensued, but the governor basically was just like, bruh, this guy John Brown, he's a mad lad, okay? We gotta fucking send everybody there. So Buchanan sends him a little-known colonel, Robert E. Lee, who was in Arlington, I believe, to lead the contingent of Marines to quickly end the standoff. After a lot of fighting and a lot of people dying, John Brown would effectively be captured and then eventually hanged. Which I believe John Wilkes Booth was there, which I think is really fascinating. But ultimately, John Brown, there's a bunch of John Browns in Kansas, but when John Brown hit Virginia around that point, it really scared the shit out of a whole bunch of different people in the South, and really only made things worse for James Buchanan in just every meaningful way. Because a lot of people were like, Kansas, Nebraska, that's one thing, but now that's spilling over into the South itself. Oh, that's scary. That means war, fam. So before we get to that, let's talk about everything else, at least the big stuff that happens during his presidency, and then we'll go through a much more, I guess you could say, specific timeline. The Utah War. Mormons, am I right? Basically, like I said before, Brigham Young has settled Utah. The Mormons in general, the Mormon community had settled in Utah. He's a fascinating individual, polygamist, etc., and Mormons were probably more states' rights than anything else, and they hated any sort of federal intervention above all, and discouraged anyone who wasn't a Mormon or anyone who was a federal government to basically leave the particular area, reaching a particular point when specifically, Pierce and more so Buchanan really started intervening and really basically started doing a whole bunch of different things. Some troops coming into the particular area, negotiators to, hey, what are you guys doing over here? And the Mormons are kind of like, it's none of your fucking business. And ultimately, things started getting violent. It's known as the Mountain Meadows Massacre, in the Mountain Meadows Massacre, Indians and Mormon militia, John D. Lee, who was this Mormon fanatic, killed a whole bunch of people that were heading for California. And, this was in direct retaliation because Buchanan had, I believe a couple weeks prior, had ordered the Mormon leader, who was the territorial governor, or the Mormon leader, Brigham Young, who was the territorial governor of Utah, to vacate his position, and he basically refused to, killing about 140 people who were going to California. And basically, Buchanan was like, "Oh hell no!" So Buchanan sends the army in late 1857 to replace Young with non-Mormon governors for the most part. This guy, Alfred Cummings, and basically violence occurs. A lot of people are fighting with one another. Brigham Young basically starts this week-long expedition of destroying wagons, trains, killing oxen, other army, like really fucking guerrilla-ass shit that's just like warfare, just tactics and whatnot. It's really interesting. It gets incredibly violent. It takes weeks of negotiations in order to actually negotiate peace for the most part. Ultimately, the end of the Utah War itself, and this is going to be just really quickly, which I think is just going to be fascinating. And Utah War, you guys should just look up because there's so much stuff that I'm just missing, but I don't want this to be a 5-hour episode because I could talk about 2 hours for the Utah War. And honestly, I'm probably going to do an episode on the Utah War itself. Anyways, Buchanan basically dispatches a whole bunch of different people to negotiate peace, and ultimately peace has occurred. Brigham Young ends up leaving, and basically the people of Utah can continue to do what they're basically going to be doing. So it's kind of like a weird compromise, and Brigham Young's like, whatever. Anyways, let's talk about this economic crisis that's occurring, known as the Panic of 1857. This is probably one of the more controversial and contingent and just one of the more important financial crises within this country's history, which is why it's of note, I would probably say. And it's one of the things that actually ends up leading to, I would probably say, Southern secession, And I'm going to be 100% honest. I'm not going to talk about completely Southern secession in Buchanan's episode. I'll probably talk about it far more in Abraham Lincoln's episode. And probably if I ever just do a series on the Civil War, I'm going to talk about it there. But this is more so just about Buchanan, his interpretations, and what a lot of things happen, and his intervention, and a lot of the things that would eventually occur. So the Panic of 1857... if you were a modern economist, could have probably seen this coming 2 miles away, like 3 years before, with a lot of things that were happening. So it's literally, and you have to understand, all these financial crises that occurs, it's not just one or two things. It's an amalgamation of 50 little things that occur that ultimately leads to an economic collapse in many ways and instances. So it's really hard to gauge one specific thing that's going to. It's a multivariate analysis is ultimately what it is, and you have to really try to look at it from various different perspectives and point of view. Like the Great Depression wasn't just because of people buying a whole bunch of shit and not paying it's everything, although that's a very different thing that happened. Like the housing crisis wasn't in the Great Recession wasn't just the housing crisis. A whole bunch of different things that go along with the housing crisis, but those were the two big things, like excessive credit and then excessive specky housing, bad loans, etc. in the recession were the two main big things. And what makes the Panic of 1857 fascinating is there's really no one specific thing. It's literally like even where there's like 100 different things that are occurring. So first and foremost, remember the gold rush was occurring during the end of Polk's presidency, and unfortunately, that only stimulated the economy and really brought it up economically in many, many, many ways. But gold started to decline because they weren't finding as large, big ass mines of gold as they were in 1849. Excuse me. And that was one aspect of it. People moving and migrating westward, doing the whole specky payment thing to buy and purchase land. I was really financially capable of them, to get a shit ton of land in California. You're golden. But people probably couldn't pay it, or their crops weren't as lucrative as they were, would ultimately lead to, them not paying back their loans, et cetera, et cetera. The expansion of the railroad system. The railroad industry was really beginning around Pierce's presidency, but really would expedite and really boom with all the people moving westward, making the railroad industry incredibly profitable. But unfortunately, people were overly putting too much money into the actual railroad stocks, and that actually ended up creating a bubble, which people just didn't see, and they kept putting more money into that bubble itself, and ultimately things just declined there. The stock market themselves declined. When one thing failed, another thing failed, and it just led to a cascading effect of a whole bunch of different companies. Insurance companies, trust companies had suspended a whole bunch of different payments, and ultimately it wasn't just America. America wasn't the great world economy, but whenever Britain failed or Europe failed, and it tended to fail a lot, America felt the effects, unfortunately, and things were not very good in Europe, and things were very contentious within Europe itself. Ultimately, this would have a very fascinating, lasting effect on the country itself, where a whole bunch of different things were going to happen. Like a whole bunch of different people kind of becoming testy with each other. Let me put it to you this way. You want to know what's going to make social division much, much, much worse in a country? How about economic problems? It's like... it's just fascinating how a lot of things are going to occur when you can't focus on trying to make money. Then you can just focus on the things that you can focus on, which is the social problems, and that only made things worse. Anyways, by 1859, the panic would kind of subside, and a lot of it had to do with, in some way, shape, and form, some intervention by James Buchanan. I wouldn't call it his specific intervention, because he ended up letting it go on longer than it probably should have. And ultimately, the economy ended up kind of figuring itself out. He had attempted to try and restrict specky payments and really hold paper money. No one could have any bills bigger than $20. Ultimately, to help basically the specky supply to increase, so that there's actually going to be more land, and to reduce the inflation rates. Ultimately, it did not, I guess you could say, relieve him immediately, and it took a long time ultimately. And it's one of those things where his plan worked, but if he just let the economy kind of figure itself out instead of reacting in that particular way, it probably would have just been fixed a lot earlier without his intervention. Now let's try and go through a brief timeline, because in the very beginning it's really just all about, Dred Scott, all that stuff. And immediately after is the Utah Wars and a whole bunch of different things that would occur there. Along the path and along the way, the beginnings of what would be the Kansas conflicts and the Lee-Compton constitutions would be occurring in the later part of his first year as the president, and also trying to vote in, and the contentious issues between Congress and James Buchanan ultimately would end up just really making things worse. It's around this time, too, James Buchanan's getting a much unnecessary for him bad name and reputation, I guess you could say. A lot of people seeing a whole lot of backdoor deals in order for him to get his way within Congress, to try and get the House to vote in for his Lee-Compton Constitution, and a whole bunch of different things were happening. A lot of people saw this on the Democratic side and really just did not like this at all. Like I had said before, James Buchanan's one that's ultimately going to split the Democratic Party. And it's a lot of the things like this that he ends up doing. Basically, just first and foremost, a committee would effectively end up being created, where basically and this committee was 5 or 6 people. Most of them are Republicans, in fairness, but they had really shown that Buchanan really awarded all his allies, everyone that was basically going to be a supporter of him, political supporter or actual congressional supporter itself, using government money to basically wage a whole bunch of different political campaigns, bribe judges, give them government property or government-owned stuff, then sold it at really low rates, and also gave them some insider trading interest. Everything you can think of, Buchanan was kind of doing. It goes so much deeper than I thought. And it makes things worse that Buchanan was one of the most purely partisan presidents, for better or worse, especially with the incredibly rising conflicts of the Republican Party coming into power and really dominating in every meaningful way in Congress themselves. And, guys like Abraham Lincoln are going to be making the big scene for the most part. So for years, in the first year or two, this is really very, very apparent, especially when the debates come about trying to get the whole Lee-Compton solution done, and trying to get, Kansas brought in as a slave state. Things only made it worse. The country themselves were not very happy at all whatsoever with Buchanan's interference in every meaningful way, in intervening within not only the country, but in a lot of ways the economy too, because a lot of the things that he ended up doing ultimately just pissed a bunch of people off. It's why are you restricting me from having my money, son? Whether it's the right thing or not the right thing, he just made people mad, okay? And a whole bunch of negative outcomes are going to come from a lot of these things. Notably, by the end of 1858 in particular, midterm elections are going to occur for the 36th United States Congress. And for the first time in years, succinctly and soundly, the Democrats effectively lose one of the houses of Congress. They will lose the House. And ultimately, understand, it's not a House majority or Republican majority. It's a Republican coalition-led majority. So there's a bunch of Northern Democrats who are really siding with them. And Buchanan is basically going to struggle to get any bills passed that he wants to actually get passed. And, the country has openly said, Buchanan, bruh, We're kind of getting sick and tired of your bullshit. So while he's doing all these things, a couple states will actually join the Union. Referendums left and right are occurring during his entire presidency for Kansas. I think there'd be about a total of 4, if I'm going to be honest with you. The first one would end very, very briefly in 1857. And then the English bill passed. The bill is named after this guy named William Hayden English, who wanted to strike the compromise between the House and the Senate on the admissions of Kansas to the Union. And basically is the bill that would resubmit the Lecompton solution and the Constitution, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really, a lot of this is just unnecessary, as long as you understand the broad viewpoint of what I'm trying to get at. But for the most part, things are only going downhill. Economic destruction, I guess you could say, within the country, and frustrations coming all around. The continuing tensions of slavery. Jefferson Davis is going to become a very, very prominent person because he's a senator of Mississippi, and he attempted to pass several federal codes that would protect slavery in those territories, and really ended up trying to ignite, I guess, in a lot of ways, much more so. Whether it was his intention or not, Jefferson Davis ultimately would end up bringing the debate between, slavery, anti-slavery, and stuff like that really into the forefront later in James Buchanan's term as president. I mean, a lot of this too was, a lot of John Brown really was in reaction to Jefferson Davis, because once Jefferson Davis, because he wasn't elected as a senator at that point. I think he may have been a House member, or wasn't even in Congress, but he was elected after the 1858 elections to become a senator for Mississippi once the midterm elections subsided. Anyways, the whole point I'm just trying to make, for the most part, is that the issues of slavery are really just going to be incredibly explosive, I guess you could say. And it's not just James Buchanan. It's a whole bunch of different other senators, House members that are fighting each other, caning each other. And the division within this country is going to lead, eventually, the 36th Congress, I believe, the House, effectively end up splitting eventually into another, section, like another sect of government. For the most part, in which case the 37th Congress would be all Republicans, but only having, so many people there. Excuse me, since, most of the southern states had actually succeeded from that point. Sorry, I keep burping. From that point in time. Ultimately, though, for James Buchanan, everything is not going this way, and he's getting blamed for everything. A lot of it is rightfully so. He's making a whole bunch of different speeches left and right that are very clearly pro-Democrat and very clearly pro-slavery. That's only continuing to ignite, tensions that are occurring throughout the entirety of his presidency, and really, really becoming much more so apparent during his latter years within office itself. He's unable to quell things with all the speeches. They did not help. He has a State of the Union address, in 1860, where he says, it's how easy it would be for the American people to settle the slavery question forever and restore peace and harmony to this distracted country. They alone can do it, and it's just like, okay, but you are the president, so you gotta have to, this is clearly an immoral by this point in time, a very big problem, and he's just not. He goes about attempting to really not address it, and really wanting the people to address it, and hoping the Dred Scott case would. He just makes it worse. It's the whole point I'm trying to make ultimately, and make it worse through horrible actions and general inaction in a multitude of different ways. So for the latter years of his presidency, as time is winding down, he's dealing with the international affairs, he's dealing with John Brown doing a whole bunch of different things, he's dealing with civil war, effectively. And everything that he's doing is making things just worse, like I said before. And, he's clearly one of the more corrupt politicians, to a point where the Democratic Party is basically like, your term and that pledge you made for serving one term, yeah, can you please keep that? Because we're okay with you trying to get another term in office. And ultimately, despite his frustrations, etc., he's just like, fine, I'm only going to do one term. Whatever happens, ultimately happens. And I did this for the union. And people were like, no, you did this for the Democratic Party. Let's just be 100% honest with you. And whatever your opinion is of slavery, that's just, okay, like, you're the president. You got to represent and try and be this bipartisan individual. Come on. Like, you're not helping the cause whatsoever, Mr. Buchanan. Anyways, an election's coming up, 1860. And like I said before with Pierce, there's a whole bunch of different political parties and factions that are trying to rise up through the smoldering flames of the Whig Party and a whole bunch of other parties, the Free Soil Party, etc., the Know Nothing parties, and the National parties, the Constitutional parties, and above all else, the Republican Party is really kind of coming up, and the Democratic Party is kind of splintering in every meaningful way one can think about. The South is eventually going to secede from the Union, obviously, but if you're a Democrat, you're going to be a Southerner, and if you're a Democrat in the North, you're going to basically end up becoming a Republican, effectively by this point in time in juncture at the end of Buchanan's presidency. You have to understand this too. This is very important. The reason why we have these two parties now today is because of the Civil War, which is the biggest reason why slavery in this country and it's so functionally important, why we always have to talk about this. And this political divide that we have ultimately is one of the most horrible political divides, and we have to know this history. And why they beat it into our heads is because we don't want another Civil War. We want people to actually live harmoniously together in one way, shape, and form, and actually respect each other in a meaningful way without, stepping on each other's personal God-given rights. If that makes any sense. Anyways, me rambling on. The Democrats are splintered. They've lost a lot of support from the Northern Democrats, and the election of 1860 is going to come up. And the election of 1860 is really, really fascinating, and I can't wait. I'm probably going to talk about 10 minutes on it just for Abraham Lincoln when I get to his episode. But there's like 15 different people there, but I would probably say the big guys would be John C. Breckinridge, who's going to be one of the people there. There's going to be a whole bunch of other individuals there. John Bell is going to be a part of the Constitutional Party. This is another opportunity for the third party to properly win, and I think it's going to be really interesting. And then, of course, everyone knows the Republican Party had given them and said, hey, let's talk about Abraham Lincoln, and he's going to be, I'm just going to say it now, he's going to end up being the president of the United States, which effectively, because of his nomination and his win, he's 7 states at the very least, which I think General Winfield Scott had warned Buchanan that at least 7 states will secede because of Abraham Lincoln's rise to the presidency, ultimately. Buchanan ends his presidency a very, very hated man in every sense of the word. And I'll get to the very tail end of his presidency. But for the most part, for the last 2 years, from, say, 1859 and 1860, he's only made things worse, putting his foot in his mouth, becoming a very, 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 very corrupt person, and then blaming his corruption on a whole bunch of different people. Whether it's the Covode Committee or just people just being like, dude, come on, you can't do this. This is just not right. You're a man who's supposed to believe in the Constitution, and you're not actually doing these constitutional things. You're killing us, bro. Come on. Once President-elect Abraham Lincoln is elected as president, Buchanan ultimately realizing the crisis that's actually going to occur with Lincoln's presidency and election, he's basically like, fuck, oh shit. Okay, maybe I fucked up, okay? Maybe I really did just fuck up, and now we're going to head to a civil war. For the rest of his life, in fairness, Buchanan's always going to be a pro-union individual. He's always going to fight for the union. He's always going to do everything he can to support the union. And ultimately, in a lot of ways, Abraham Lincoln's presidency, good for him. And ultimately, when Lincoln gets elected, and there's already talk of Southern secession, especially from the southern states. It's known as the Crittenden Compromise or the Crittenden Amendments, where John J. Crittenden of Kentucky, he proposes a bunch of actual constitutional amendments, trying to finalize the actual Constitution to allow slavery below the 36th parallel. Excuse me. Lincoln wasn't going to go for that. He just said, no, we're not doing that. And Buchanan actually agreed with him and really wanted to do things as peacefully as he possibly could. Buchanan would send several messages to Congress in almost basically like 2 months before the end of his presidency to find another compromise. Please, we got to do some stuff like that. But ultimately, by the time nothing really ends up happening, the South isn't going to be moving, the North isn't going to be moving, and Buchanan realizes with like a month left to go in his presidency that civil war is going to happen, and that it's going to be very violent, it's going to be very bloody, and that there's nothing he can do about it. Ultimately, the last month or so really are going to be dominated by Fort Sumter, I might want to add. Fort Sumter would be the part in which, the first shot that's going to start the Battle of Fort Sumter is going to be the really big battle that's going to determine, the beginning of the Civil War. And Buchanan knows this, and he really knows that this is going to be, I don't want to say, because he's located near Charleston. It's not saying he knows that this is going to happen, but he effectively understands specifically that whatever side starts the war first is going to be the side that's going to be the aggressor in a lot of ways. And he doesn't want to be the aggressor, even though Fort Sumter is this view of the federal government in a lot of ways, and especially the North, and really the South was just against it in every sense of the way. So he chooses in a lot of ways to not supply it, hoping that the South would be the aggressor. There's a whole bunch of different interpretations on how you can look at it, because he attempted to really supply it, rearm them, but ultimately when the last couple of supply whatever shipments we want to say, that was going to occur doesn't occur. A lot of it has to do with Buchanan himself, and I believe his Secretary of War, once Abraham Lincoln gets elected in the office, Buchanan just gives it up and gives it to Lincoln. Buchanan spends the last couple months trying to make sure the South doesn't secede from the Union, which I think are very interesting conventions, debates that would effectively occur. You have to understand, too, a whole bunch of different people are still alive. John Tyler is still alive, the 10th president, and he's going to... Sorry, there's a car coming by. And he's going to effectively end up siding with the Confederacy. A whole bunch of the other presidents are still alive. They're seeing what is happening. And Lincoln is going to be president, our 16th president, and the world and the United States, once he gets elected, will never be the same again. I'll explain, to talk about the actual presidency in reflection for James Buchanan. But first, I just want to talk about his retirement. I would say it's pretty brief for the most part, and it depends on how one really, looks at one's retirement. He doesn't really do much, though, within the final years. And I will just say this right now. He will die in June 1st of 1868 at the age of 77 as a sage of Wheatland, and Wheatland himself in Lancaster. And I think because of respiratory failure. I think he had a cold, probably pneumonia, bronchitis, bronchiectasis, whatever you want to call it. Well, I mean, asis, the end of it means it's irreversible, but he probably just had a whole bunch of different lung problems. Anyways, it was just really difficult for him to really breathe. I'll just say that's when he died. Buchanan, once he leaves office, is a fucking pariah in every meaningful way. Even though he lived a private, comfortable life to end it for the most part in his Pennsylvania home. You want to talk about it, you want to talk about a man who gets blamed for every functional thing. Don't get me wrong, I think he deserves it in some way, shape, and form. But the level that he went to actually basically get blamed for everything was substantial. If any president got blamed today, my lord. He might have been the single most hated president in this country's history. Buchanan, North and South did not like him. At least with Pierce, there was a lot of hatred. There was a lot of frustrations, but people basically forgot about Pierce and only remember Buchanan. So I want to make that very, 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 very clear. The Capitol buildings were all vandalized, people damaging it, and posters with Buchanan's face on it and just pictures of him were basically vandalized, with people drawing nooses around his neck, calling him Judas, and basically everyone's questioning everything that Buchanan had ever done, and he's basically saying, everything I did for the Union. And in fairness, he supports the Union, like I said before, for the rest of his life, and supports the presidency, surprisingly, and supported Lincoln in every sense of the word, although he always attempted to defend his actions or his level of inaction. At home, which I'm going to talk about more. At home, he ends up returning home to Wheatland in Lancaster. His niece Harriet, like I said, who had been supporting the household, she's already married, and she and her husband had started living in the Lancaster Wheatland house for quite some time, overtaking it and taking care of it. And he would ride horses and really tend to the garden during this period in time, occasionally, whenever he could, giving his speeches and giving his final say on a whole bunch of different things about life. He was still very, I guess you could say people wanted to go talk to him all the time, even near the end of his life. Buchanan, I would say from 1862 to his death, ultimately defends the Union in every sense of the word, despite everyone second-guessing everything that he's done. A whole bunch of people are second-guessing and condemning the actions when it comes to Fort Sumter, and the Republican Party is basically just so viral against him in every sense of the word that it's really fascinating. General Winfield Scott had actually sent several letters to Buchanan, in which case which were actually published in a newspaper, I believe, the National Intelligencer, basically condemning everything that he had did, and Buchanan had actually attempted to defend himself in that letter. He also actually been writing the most public defense that he's ever written in his entire life. It was actually called Mr. Buchanan's Administration on the Eve of Rebellion, which basically was published after the Civil War. And had also started writing a biography too, which wouldn't be finalized until 1883. Buchanan basically just spends the last couple years also really just dealing with at this point, the really super abolitionist, borderline radical Republican Party. They're trying to basically, through the Senate, take him down in every meaningful way. A lot of Lincoln's appointments and a lot of people in Lincoln's administration were actually either former cabinet members or former people who are part of Buchanan's presidency. And ultimately, they just refuse to support him in any meaningful way. Buchanan, for the end of his life, is really banished in terms of the political gain and really a pariah. And, and say what you will about Buchanan, but it's unfortunate for a man who's devoted his entire life to public service and politics, really just being pushed aside in every meaningful way. And for the last 2 years of his life, partly because he really couldn't move or do anything. He had gout. He had pneumonia. Buchanan would effectively end up dying. He left behind the large estate, a shit ton of money, which he divided upon a whole bunch of different relatives. The house would be left to his niece. And ironically, in a lot of ways, Buchanan, before he died, would always say that history will vindicate me in a lot of ways, which I think is fascinating. Let's just talk about it. Let's just talk about it now. Was James Buchanan a terrible president? He was fucking horrible. He's fucking horrible. Even the most ardent biographers basically even admit that, he was a very questionable person. And although I think he had the best of intentions, ultimately it didn't work out in his favor. He's basically someone that's like, I'm not going to do anything unless it's going to benefit me, my party, etc., etc. And he's a very politically motivated, politically biased individual for his own political future. He's always kind of just been like that throughout his entire life, I think he's kind of someone that when I look at, I just see someone who thinks that they're doing good, that they're doing great things. And here's my thing. A lot of these people who have the same personality that become, politicians or presidents, I tend to look at in a very negative view, because they all end up doing the exact same thing, and they all end up doing a lot of the same shit that a lot of these people do. I think there's more comparisons to James Buchanan and FDR than there would be to Buchanan and say, like, and then again, Reagan's going to be a very complicated person when I get to him, but, Reagan, for instance, or hell, even like Jimmy Carter, Carter's not the worst person ever. I just think his ideas are weird and bad, and ultimately did a lot of negative things to this country, but you know what I mean? It's just personalities. You can kind of see it from the get-go. Whatever your opinion is of, like, for instance, Joe Biden, I tend to think he's probably going to be much more of a James Buchanan than anything else, and again, I'm indifferent to Trump, to be quite honest with you, but I'm getting way too political now. Point functionally being that there's like an archetypical personality that I started to notice when I was doing my research into Buchanan, and for better or worse, I ended up really thinking to myself, who other presidents tend to be like him, and a lot of these other presidents that I, at the very least when I'm doing my research, tend to become like Buchanan or have a lot of the similar stuff with Buchanan, a lot of the personality traits, which are you're mischievous, you're very, I don't even want to say narcissistic is the right way to do it, but you believe in something, and that something is going to be, in your opinion, the thing that's going to help make you this honorable, indifferent individual. Because Buchanan's basically always been a people pleaser kind of individual and person. He's also been someone that thinks he's principled and does certain things that are principled, but not everything that is principled or should be principled, if that makes any sense. He's very selective in his principalities, but it's like, if I follow this in terms of the Constitution, then it's perfectly fine and reasonable. But then it's also, you're not doing the entirety of what your job ultimately is in defending and executing the Constitution in the way that it's supposed to be. And it's a lot of these specific people, for the most part. And I guess what I'm trying to say is this, if you're going to be someone who's going to be someone that's going to follow the Constitution and be a principled individual, then you're going to follow the Constitution and be principled more often than not. Either that, or, and it sounds bad, but I'd rather have someone in office that's like, look, I'm not going to follow the Constitution, I'm just going to do whatever I want, instead of being this fake-ass person. That's fine. If I'm going to be 100% honest with you, and if you voted in, you're voted in. It is what it is, It's one of those things, I guess is what I'm trying to say, is like, if you're going to be on one end of the spectrum, be on one end of the spectrum. Don't be in the middle, because if you're in the middle, when it comes to executing what you're supposed to be doing, you're going to be someone who's going to do those things regardless of what your political affiliation is, how principled you think you are, etc., etc. That's going to be biased. And you're going to do things, ultimately, that will hurt this country, because human nature exists, okay? And if you're in the middle, then you're only going to do things selectively that's going to benefit you. And that's James Buchanan. And that's a lot, unfortunately, in this country's history, a lot of presidents that tend to be very selective in how they interpret things. That being said, though, let me play devil's advocate to myself. Because I think when he left office, I think he was genuinely surprised, or at least at the very end of his presidency, that things were as bad as they were. I think he wasn't cognizant or conscientious of the realities that he was a very disliked president, a very disliked individual, and that, Congress is only doing these things because of politics, not because they, dislike me or anything. And ultimately, he was wrong. He was wrong in any meaningful way, and I think that he was kind of surprised when Congress is like, nah, bro, we're not really for you. Can you like leave and not I think by the end of his presidency, him trying to defend himself in any meaningful way is more of a reaction to him coming to grips with the truth that people just didn't like him. And I think he might have had a different perspective and interpretation of whether or not people liked him or not. And I think that's just who he was as a person. A lot of people always liked him, but were always politically, I guess you could say, motivated one way or another to not like him or not give him a particular position, etc., etc., And, his life is fascinating. He's a very complicated person. He's had demons, I mean, most people get over things, and most people don't get over things. And whether or not you think, for instance, he's gay, I guess you could say, because there's a whole bunch of different stories about him and his sexuality. Apparently there's stories about Lincoln too, which I don't know. I'm not going to be shocked either way, shape, or form. I don't think so, but who knows. But for Buchanan, people have issues. People have demons. People react to certain things in different ways. And, I look at Buchanan, I just see someone that, like, whether or not you agree, you make this pledge to never marry and do all this stuff, becoming the first bachelor president. It's probably something that just triggers you. That's not normal behavior, is ultimately what I come down to. And I think, I can try to explain it in my perspective and point of view, but ultimately I really can't. Most people get lonely, and I don't know how effectively he ended up living his life in that way, shape, and form. I just think of him fascinating, if that makes any sense. He's a guy that became a Federalist, or was a Federalist, that became a Democrat and changed his whole entire political fundamental foundation, his structure, and, people come to a whole bunch of different conclusions about a whole bunch of different things, Like, people were basically like, oh, Reagan was a Democrat before he became a Republican. Like, I don't really pay that much mind to it. I mean, there is credence there, absolutely, when I bring it up when I talk about Reagan. But, at the very same end of the spectrum, like, both parties are rough. Both parties are different. Both parties have foibles in history. Once I get to, like, Rutherford B. Hayes and, and Chester Arthur, and it's going to be very rough going for Republicans, if I'm going to be 100% honest with you. I don't know. I guess is ultimately what I'm trying to say when I try and talk about Buchanan, because he's a bit of an enigma. A lot of these presidents are very enigmas because I don't know who these people are. I've never met them. I've never seen who they are. I think I'll get to much more optimistic or much more realistic perspective of more of the modern presidents, because we've actually heard these people talk. We've seen them. We've gone up. But for Buchanan, we don't know. Everything we know about him is what we know, and it is what it is. So you can have your own perspective and opinion on James Buchanan. And all I'm trying to say is that for all his faults and foibles, there is a reason why he failed. And it's much more so, I think, because of how maybe he was raised, how he grew up in life, how he just interacted with people. And I think it's really interesting to look at James Buchanan, which is a big reason why I end up focusing on a lot of the childhood aspects of a lot of these presidents. Ultimately is to really understand the fundamental foundation that they grew up with, And that being said, though, what's undeniable is that, at least as of right now, in 1857 or 1861, James Buchanan is this country's single worst president ever. I thought Pierce would have, much worse, and he's easily one of the worst, but Buchanan's far worse. Buchanan is far worse because it's very clearly exceptionally partisan and politically motivated that's going to benefit one party. You can at least make the argument for Pierce that he mainly did it just so that, he could keep the Democratic Party together, which he did in some regards and respects, at least for one more election before the Democrats really are just and would be down for the next 20 to 30 years, until the rise of, I guess, the Democrats and the populist movement, and basically just the rejection of the Republican ideas that would eventually lead to a shit ton of corruption. Let's just be honest. And ultimately lead to much more political divisiveness that would effectively end up changing this country for the next century or so. But for Buchanan, his presidency is by far the worst. There's just no argument about it. Everything he did ultimately from the get-go was always going to be a negative presidency, and there's nothing one can really ultimately think about it. Everything that he did ultimately just exceeded and excited tensions, and just made things so much worse than it should have been and could have been, in my opinion. Could he have avoided civil war? No. Once he was elected, once the Dred Scott case and a whole bunch of other factors ultimately led to that from previous years, and even things that he just couldn't control, it was always going to lead to civil war. But I would argue he probably pushed that expectation much more so by destroying the Democratic Party and ultimately letting the Republicans rise so much more so that Abraham Lincoln becomes president, and then the South succeeds. So now you're probably asking yourself, what should we think of James Buchanan then? That really is up to you. I've probably done this numerous fucking times where I'm trying to figure out what the legacies of these people are, and ultimately I really don't know. And Buchanan is so much more complicated than that. He's really an enigma as a president. I really don't know what he's thinking about. And I don't think a lot of people or biographers even really know what he's thinking about. There's a lot of people that think they know who he is. I don't really know who he is. I read all this information about him, 3 different things about, or like I read about 5 or 6 different sources from different biographies, different books, history books, his own personal biography, the American President's books. There's a compilation of biographies, research articles and whatnot, and they all give me different perspectives, and yet I can believe all of them, and I can also dismiss all of them at the same time, and I don't know. He's an enigma, ultimately, and a president that's, you feel like and you feel like you understand, but there's just something off about him that you can't really get at, that you really can't describe or detail. And, it's kind of nagging in a lot of ways when I'm thinking about James Buchanan. If I had to say this about his legacy, I would say this. Buchanan is a president, ultimately, that is one that makes it very clear that whoever is the president in charge is ultimately going to change this country for meaningful ways. The president really is one that's ultimately going to decide the fate of the country, if that makes any sense, which is why presidential elections, and as of the recording of this, the election of 2020 is coming around, that really should excite people in the sense that things are occurring. The presidency is actually really fucking important, whether or not we agree with the level of power that a president has, because the president does not have this level of power today that they did, back then, or vice versa. The president back then does not have the same level of power that they do today, so I think that should scare people. But even back then, the presidency ultimately decided the way that the country was going in some way, shape, and form. And once Buchanan gets elected, he shows that this country is going to be heading for a civil war. He's one of the presidents that's going to really solidify anything in any form of semblance of peace. Negatively impact that. He's basically going to be one that's going to be the antithesis of any semblance of peace and potential aversion to war. That being said, I will end on this one final note. He thought history would vindicate him. I don't know if any man who had gone through his presidency, gone through his time, would have said anything similar to that. It's very, 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 very fascinating. Some of his last known statements and his last words, that history will vindicate him. I don't know. The more that comes out, history only solidifies the reality of that particular point in time. Could Buchanan have actually been someone who history just hates just because of media bias, or because, history is just not fair to certain people, for better or worse, he was a loser. Abraham Lincoln was a winner. And then when you look at more of Abraham Lincoln, you tend to have a much more fascinating perspective of Abraham Lincoln. I'll put it to you that way. And, who knows? And in fairness to Buchanan, he's always going to be shit on legacy-wise for effectively being the guy who's going to ignite the Civil War in a lot of ways, He's going to be the TNT, and Lincoln becomes the actual explosion of dynamite, okay? What I'm saying. And for Buchanan, that's unfortunately always going to be his legacy, regardless. Should that be his legacy? That's up to you to find out, and up to you to do your own research and to look at everything that you can look at, because I can only give you so much information. I can only tell you so much, and I can't tell you what you should do. So you should look up this yourself and try and figure it out. But I will say this. History is honest and objective, and I think the truth will come out from that honesty. And I think if we look at history the way that it should be looked at, we'll get to the truth. And hopefully, I think I figured out the truth with James Buchanan, whatever that truth may be. Thank you guys for listening. If you guys want to listen to another episode, just, listen. Thank you guys, and have a great day. No biscuits.